29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29.
O'clock start.
Morning members, can I remind you that all your devices should be switched off and that tablets should be set to mute. Before the meeting opens, We've already discussed our oral briefing today, so you'll find a briefing on page 8 of your table of papers. We've received apologies from Megan and Danny. Have members received any other apologies? That's it. Agenda item 2, the draft minutes.
Sorry,
That's the thing.
Oh, Chair, good man, Gordon, you keep us right.
Well, we'll do our
That's it.
best.
Agenda item number 2, the draft minutes. The draft minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of September are at page 5. Are members content with the draft minute?
Right. What about a new member?
That's agenda item number 3 on the chairperson's business, Gordon. I'd like to welcome Mr William Humphrey and Chris Hazard to the committee. Are members content for the committee to write to the outgoing members, Sammy and Mitchell, thanking them for their input and commitment to the work of the committee?
Great.
Declaration of interest. Tabled today is a copy of the register of interest for the new members, and these are pages 3 and 4 of our table papers. Heather has joined the committee as a bursary student, so Heather, you're very welcome. We look forward to working with you. There's a revised agenda tabled today to facilitate October monitoring, which has been added as a substantive item at agenda item number 8. So you'll find the revised agenda tabled within your table on the front of your table papers. The Chamber of Commerce and Industry event, the committee had agreed that the chairperson attend the Chamber of Commerce and Industry event Corporation Tax, seizing the opportunity on behalf of the committee on the 21st of October. Members will have received a copy of correspondence and members' info informing that the Chamber of Commerce, having reflected on the current political situation, has decided to postpone the event. Has any members any comments or content to note?
Noted. Hear it.
There's an event to showcase higher education in the further education sector, and papers for this item are pages 13 and 14. Members have been invited by Colleges NI to attend a further education showcase event in the Long Gallery on the 14th of October from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Patsy has indicated that he's available to attend following next week's committee meeting, and can members notify the committee office before 4 o'clock today if they wish to attend. The committee has established a Twitter account. It was activated on the 29th of September, and the response has been very positive. Have members any comments? Or members happy to continue promoting the committee's Twitter page?
Yes, good.
Tabled today is a paper from the clerk summarising the issues that were raised by representatives of SDC trailers when the committee visited last week, and this paper is at page 6 of table papers. Any members that were there?
Yes. What page, sorry?
Do you want to tell us your learning from it?
There's Mr. Sparky, businessman up there.
Paul there too, was it?
Paul's the man. Yep.
Sorry, what was that? What page?
The visit from SDC is page 6.
Of table papers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say this was a very good visit as expected when you go out to local businesses and see what they do, manufacturing, engineering. We learned a lot on the visit, not only of what they do and how they do it, with regards to production lines and their factory floors, but we also talked about some of the issues that they did have. The biggest issue, I think, for SDC is the skills gap and the linkage that needs to be created, better linkage that needs to be created between our schooling, our education sector, and employability, in order that SDC get the actual employees that they need. They are having problems there in that regard, even when you look at let's take one in particular, welders, the shortage of welders, and that is a massive problem for someone like the SDC. So there was issues. Other issues, of course, which we all know, was the energy, cost of energy. Doesn't affect SDC as much as the skills gap, but still it's a massive issue for engineering and manufacturing. So those were only two of some of the issues that we discussed with them.
I think Dad said you're happy enough.
No, I just concur with a lot of that. I would say I was very impressed with the visit and their setup up there, and talking to the people themselves. They appear to be working at full capacity up there. Their capacity seems to have been actually for expansion. As Paul says, in relation to the skills that's being brought through from our colleges and all at the minute in our schools, seems to be lacking there, and there has to be some ways of maybe connecting again. As coming from my generation in the past days, that we had the apprenticeships coming through with employers and looking for skills like welders and things, that seems to be missing. There has to be some work done there to try and get that to come through to help firms like SDC and such like going forward. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be very important in the future, where we'll go from more from the public service jobs into the private sector. So something we could work on.
Members happy enough to consider some of the issues that were raised next week and pass your turns and see what issues were brought we can do to try and sort some of them out.
Yep, great.
Agenda item number 4, an oral briefing from BNN Energy Group on microgrids. Some background information has been provided for members, which includes a cover note on page 16, an information sheet on microgrids and correspondence from the Ulster Farmers Union at page 18. Briefing the committee today from BNN Energy Group is Mr David Surplus, and you're very welcome, David. So do you want to make your opening statement, and then we'll follow it up with some questions afterwards?
Okay. Well, hello everybody. Thanks for inviting me along today. I suppose I'd like to open just by reminding you about who B9 Energy is and sort of the relevance of what we've done in the past. Principally, we started in 1992 as a wind farm developer, and we were one of the most successful of the early pioneering companies. We built up 10 wind farms altogether in Northern Ireland. In 2006, we recognised that onshore wind farming had ceased to be entrepreneurial. The best sites had gone, there was more competition, more difficult to get planning, and grid access was becoming difficult as well. And so we sold that company and cashed out of onshore wind development. We then took the proceeds from that sale and put it into the other emerging renewable energies, anaerobic digestion. We've built and is now commissioning the large digester at Dungannon, which is the largest on the island of Ireland. Into solar PV as well, we've been investing some money about developing those sorts of projects. And also, we recognised that energy storage was going to be something that was needed in the future because of the higher and higher penetrations of intermittent renewables on the grid. Sooner or later we would have to do a lot of storing. We also developed an interest in offshore technologies. We've worked up projects for both tidal on the north coast and offshore wind. We're part of the First Flight Wind Consortium, which holds a Crown Estates licence for developing the offshore site off the County Down coast. And the recent figures from DETI would suggest that there's a chance of significant curtailment of wind by 2020, maybe even up to 9% of delivered energy being curtailed because of the lack of load at the times when the wind is blowing. And for a very large project like offshore wind, this is potentially a significant barrier to confidence on the investment, etc. So we set about trying to define which of the energy storage technologies were going to be the most useful in smoothing out the intermittent renewables in the Northern Ireland context. We did 4 years of in-house research on batteries, compressed air, electrochemical processes, electrolysis, hydrogen, methanization, ammonia, all of these techniques. We looked at how you convert energy into heat, electrical energy into heat, electrode boilers, heat pumps, large-scale water storage, all of those things. And we quickly realised, actually, that trying to establish the balance between load and generation, that a new technique of microgrids, which was emerging in the United States, in Germany and in Denmark, was going to be quite relevant for the deployment of energy storage. In fact, microgrids need energy storage as much as energy storage needs microgrids, and renewables need the whole lot of it. So our energy storage company has now gone down the road of trying to understand how microgrids work, what they are for a start and how they work, and how it would be best to try and deploy them in the Northern Ireland context. And we're really looking at everything from a domestic house that has solar panels on the roof, that is currently exporting all of its power onto the grid if it's not used, to actually hold on to some of that in the house in a battery and use it later after the sun has gone down, and justify the investment in that energy storage battery on avoided cost of importing power from the grid. Then you look at the fact that it is lawful to run a private line to your next door neighbour and join hands with him and work together, where you might have a big roof and no power. He needs a lot of power and he's got no roof space, so you work together. And that really is the first point in time where you would consider a microgrid being formed. You can go to an industrial estate, and we're doing one in Larne at the moment, at the Willowbank industrial estate, which would be a grouping of 5 or 6 different firms. They all have different power requirements and different areas of roof that would be useful for solar, and we're trying to integrate them all together. We're doing a very large-scale urban microgrid at Coleraine with Coleraine Council, and we're doing a large-scale rural grid network at Lakeale in County Down with the Down District Farmers for Renewable Energy, which is a local community group. There are difficulties with this, of course, but what the microgrids promise is that there would be a price of electricity that was struck that was much lower than you would currently have to pay to the main system for your energy. So if you're a load customer, you wouldn't be paying as much for your electricity. And also, if you're a generator connected to that microgrid, you would be paid more for your electricity than the current off-takers would give you as well. So it's a win-win, irrespective of whether you're a load customer stakeholder or a generation stakeholder. Both would benefit. We see the models in Germany preferring social enterprises as being the ownership model for microgrids, and we've teamed up with Ledcom in Larne, who are specialists in that side of things, to look at how we can establish the governance of the microgrid companies. They would be limited by guarantee, they would be probably charitable status, and they would be social enterprises. And that way you can get the buy-in from the various authorities and from the planning authorities, and you gain the confidence of the industrial and commercial customers that would become part of the network. And we're intentionally leaving out the domestic sector from the microgrids at the moment, because you can't really rely on them as a source of long-term power purchase agreements. But once the project would get across the line and financially close and go to the construction phase, then you go to the domestic sector and you certainly do sell them power. It would be on a shorter term basis, and it would be done through the social enterprise mechanism as a way of reducing fuel poverty. So their ability to pay the bills would be determined, and then a price would be given to them which would allow them to have affordable energy. And that gives the industrial and commercial stakeholders in the microgrid a good route to corporate social responsibility, and that's something which they're very interested in. So I think that's probably where we're at. I know you have some questions, and I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the presentation, David. What is the potential scale at which microgrids could operate here?
Well, on the side, the urban side, the microgrid proposed for Coleraine would be about 7 miles of buried cable, and in the same trench would be a heat pipe as well. So it would link up all of the industrial estates, the hospital, the university, the town centre traders, all together onto one system. It would have a 33,000 volt network, and it would connect to a 110 kV substation. So that would be the footprint of the urban system. If you go to a rural environment, we were very keen to see the regulations that have been written down into the single electricity market provision. It's a provision called a demand side unit, which allows third parties to come along and take control of the 11 kV networks. Now, it's not fully developed yet, and it's not something which you can actually do today, but with a certain bit of development, we thought that it would be a good mechanism whereby we could take on board the monitoring and control of 11 kV rural networks and establish those to be part of the microgrid. So it would be terminating really at the 33 kV station. And if we were to do that, then we would be able to do it another 69 times, because there's probably about 70 of these rural substations in Northern Ireland.
Okay. And what would be the capacity that, say for example, the microgrid you're proposing in Coleraine could operate at?
Well, we don't know yet. We've just been writing the strategy document at the moment, and be presenting that to the Council sometime in November. And provided they accept that, then we would move to the technical feasibility, commercial feasibility, and eventually work to an economic appraisal, which would be in readiness for going to funders, both public and private, to try and get the money together to build it. But in theory, it could take in just about all of the existing loads in the town.
Okay. And what length of time are you talking about, in best case scenario, for this to be up and running in?
Again, I don't really know. It would depend on the complexities around the permissions and wayleaves and planning that we need to get, and what sort of support there would be from the local community and from the council. I mean, it's not really been done in the UK so far on this scale. It's been done in other countries, and quite successfully, and we're trying as best as possible to use those models which they have already developed in Germany and Denmark, for instance, and adapt them for Northern Ireland conditions.
And you talked about the figure of 9% curtailment. Is that for all wind, or is that just onshore or offshore, is it both?
I can't just remember now, but it's it's a big number. It's way beyond the difference between profit and loss as a wind farm owner-operator. And so it's a very serious question in the future as to whether or not wind projects would be viable, because the power purchase agreement that you have with your off-taker of the energy would have a clause in it that says that the wind farm would be subject to curtailment from time to time. They wouldn't be prescriptive about when it would happen or for how long each episode would take. All they would be able to say is that over the life of the wind farm, the problem would steadily get worse. Northern Ireland's got one of the highest penetrations of wind on any grid in the world now, and so we're beginning to get these problems. It has the potential to bring the wind industry to a halt, and of course, because it's the cheapest form of renewables, it's really the mainstay of our, getting towards the renewables targets. So rather than curtail the wind turbines, what we want to do is to be able to put controllable load onto the grid at that right moment, have enough of it that we can just flick a switch, put on the load, and now the turbines don't need to be curtailed. And that would preserve the revenue streams for the wind farm owners and make them have less issues around financeability. Now, we think that the application of the load at the right moment is therefore a very valuable service to the wind farm industry, and that they, of course, have to pay for that service. And we think it's probably worth about a third of the revenue from the wind farms at the time when the load on demand is in place. And for an offshore wind farm, that might be around about 5 pence a unit as the fee for providing the load on demand. And at the same time, the energy storage or the load managing company would have to buy its electricity off the single electricity market. But at the point of curtailment, the market prices come right down to its minimum to try and dissuade new generators from coming on. So you would be buying your power at 2 or 3p at the same time as somebody's giving you 5p for the service that you're providing. So net, to an energy storage company, it could be a negative cost of electricity. And you start putting that into the economics of batteries, of isothermal compressed air energy storage, into electrolysis even, then you begin to see that in this new world there's a type of economic driver which doesn't exist in the past. And we're trying to identify that, to characterize it, quantify it, and then convert it into revenue streams that would help to monetize the technologies and be able to, so we could bring these projects to market.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for your information so far. It's very informative, very impressive. You've done this without any notes, so very, very good. You certainly know what you're talking about. I'm intrigued by the whole concept of microgrids. I certainly have a thirst to learn more of it and more about it. And I think maybe the committee should look into research around the best models around the world at present. But whilst I understand the concept and the rationale for it, I still can't get it into my head how it works in practice. And I think, I assume by your presentation that you're working on that as you go along to that degree, because it's not a finite science or a complete science yet. But there you have, you've got your 11 kV grid all over the place supplying everybody. And then you want to, with a microgrid, lay nearly a parallel circuit to pick up, let's say, for instance, a town of the size of Coleraine and all of the people within it. But yet then also take control of the 11 kV system too. So how does that actually work in practice, in cabling and switch gear and technology? How can it operate parallel to the grid as we know it?
Well, there's two types really of microgrids. One that would be off the grid, autonomous and separate from the grid. And that would be something like a small island, and sometimes it's called an islanded system. And that is just self-contained, and it doesn't use the existing grid at all. You then have a grid-tied microgrid, which sometimes acts on its own and sometimes is connected to the grid so that power can move from the microgrid into the main grid or from the main grid into the microgrid. And the amount of traffic, the amount of energy that would be transferred across that grid tie is determined by two things. One is the MIC, the maximum input capacity, and the maximum, the MEC, the maximum export capacity, because they are different. The existing grid was designed for one-way traffic from the central power stations out to all of the loads which are distributed at the end of the 11 kV networks. It wasn't designed for generators to be embedded into the 11 kV network. So if you have an existing grid connection, you can use it up to the maximum import capacity anytime you like, as long as you're connected and everything's safe. And a microgrid would want to do that because most of the wind farms are out in the west of Northern Ireland, for instance. They're connecting in at up to 110,000 volts, and that power can make its way over to the east. So if you had a microgrid in the east, it could organise itself to put its loads onto the grid at the right time when peak wind is happening, and allow the turbines to continue running so they wouldn't be curtailed. Now you're using the importing off the grid up to the maximum import capacity every time that happens. When the wind dies down, that routine comes to an end. until the next time. And what you do then is batten down the hatches. You've stored some of this energy, you've converted it into heat, you've got compressed air tanks, you've got full batteries, whatever it is, and you start to use that internally, not with the grid in mind. You try and consume it in a managed way. And then, if you get to the point where you're also generating on the microgrid, you might have solar panels and wind turbines connected to your own cables. You might then want to export onto the grid. You really want to avoid exporting onto the grid because you don't get much money for it. And also, it means at another time you have to buy from the grid at a high price. So part of the economics of a microgrid is to displace the need to import high-price power off the grid. So therefore, its avoided cost is the economic driver. So you're really looking at one-way traffic off the grid with the minimum possible going onto the grid, and anything that does go onto the grid would be at peak times of day between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock at night when the energy prices are high. Then the energy storage plant can get involved with arbitrage, which is where you buy energy cheap and you sell energy at a high price, and that would be one of the tenets of economic viability of an energy storage project. The third type of microgrid is where you're on the grid. You're actually just commandeering, maybe isn't the right word, but you're utilising the existing 11 kV networks and utilising that as if it were a microgrid. You're managing it in a way that the microgrids are managed. You're using the same technology. And actually, the technology for managing a microgrid is exactly the same technology for managing the main grid anyway. If you go to Bracknell in London, or GE have their headquarters for the UK, they have demonstrations of all of the electrical control systems for the 110 kV, the 33 kV systems, and they do that for all of the utilities in GB just about. And they do some work over in Ireland here as well. And what they would simply do is give you an 11 kV version of that, and it would monitor the voltage principally and the frequency on the system, and it would make sure that the generation and the load was always in balance. And it would do it by not just by curtailing the generators, which is one method. It's the sort of final thing you can do is curtailment. But before you do that, you put as much load onto the system as you can. And the secret is having as much controllable load as you possibly can. And that's where Coleraine is so good, because it's got the Riverband, a heat pump that would produce a lot of background heat for a district heating system taking in the whole town. And onto that exact system you put electrode boilers, which are very small, cheap things, but they consume vast quantities of electricity to produce great quantities of hot water in a short space of time, and they can keep going hour after hour after hour. It all then depends on how big your water tanks are. And in Coleraine we're proposing to put in something of the order of 20,000 tonnes of hot water in 5 big tanks that are 20 metres diameter and 20 metres deep each. So a very large thermal store which would heat the town for days on end, even when the wind goes down. Coleraine particularly attractive as well because it has the tidal farms feeding into it, and whilst they're intermittent, they are completely predictable, and there will be times when there's just too much power coming from the tide, and Coleraine would be able to be a sponge and soak that up.
It's going to take technology. It's going to take storage capacity. It's going to take generation itself, whether that be solar farms, wind turbines, or tidal, or thermal. All this comes at a cost. Who pays for it?
Well, this is, broadly speaking, it's infrastructure. So it's cables, wires, transformers, pipes, tanks, conversion devices, batteries, storage tanks or air. And all of that infrastructure if the microgrid company was established as a social enterprise, and it would be typically the council and an electricity utility company joining together. If it was Germany, that's what it would be.
Okay.
And then all of the other stakeholders, be they load customers or generator customers, would all become a shareholder in that social enterprise company. It would then be the company that does the development of the project. It would own the project, and it would do the financing of it. And it means that people connecting to the network don't have to pay for the capex or the grid connection.
But obviously, with standard controls and standard rules of engagement, if you like, for want of a better word, here in Northern Ireland, where there's a price control, and that's periodic. And NIE have obviously a massive instrument in that, as have Sony with regards to monitoring the grid and controlling the grid. Where do they fit into all of it? And where's the cost burden or the profit for them? Or how do you see them? What part do they play in this, in the infrastructure?
Well, if you build a 33 kV private network as part of a microgrid, then it has to be handed over to NIE to be the owner-operator of that. They would be responsible for it. So it becomes their asset, but the trading over that network would be done by the microgrid company. And the control system would have to meet the approval of the Sony and everybody else. All the other grid codes would all have to be approved and be compatible.
In the last price control, have the utility regulator, have they missed the trick there with regards to microgrids? Were they aware of microgrids in the last price control? Was that a factor? Was that part of the equation?
I don't really know about that. We've been looking at microgrids for about 3 years now, and I think that's sort of fairly normal for the UK. They've been around a few years longer than that in Germany and Denmark and the States. It's still new stuff, really, and there's a lot of people need to get up to speed before you can press any sort of a go button.
Yes.
And of course that's what we're trying to do now.
Chair, I think Fergal wants to come in on something, but my last question is around the Frost Valley project in New York, upstate. Are you aware of that project?
I'm not. No.
The question was really, microgrids here, would it be more to do with security of supply or more to do with the cost of electricity and generating of it?
In my book, it's to do with avoiding curtailment of wind farms.
Right, okay.
But of course it does offer a duplicate source of energy to people who are concerned about security of supply, and it does reduce the cost of energy to industrial customers, who are the ones who are particularly affected in Northern Ireland at the moment with high prices. So it'll solve different problems for different people. United States, certainly it was I forget the word now. It's a robust resilience because of like the Hurricane Katrina came through and storms, so that if there is a tendency to have a blackout, then it's only parts of it that will be out, other parts will be preserved. And they're also very concerned about the threat of terrorism as well in America, where some of the big central substations could be taken out, and that would black out large areas.
Okay, thank you.
David, have you any idea of what financial savings this could offer against curtailment costs?
Well, for the wind farm owner, it means you would continue with your revenue streams.
No, but I mean from an electricity consumer point of view.
I don't really know what the overall effect would be. What I do know is that we would be seeing more of our homegrown energy used rather than not used, and that in the round would mean we would actually import less gas for the power stations.
Yeah, sorry, just a small point, but it was raised last week, and it could be a big point depending on what way you like the answers. But if a microgrid's off the grid, that advantages, say for example, Coleraine, but it disadvantages consumers elsewhere, because we still left with the bill to pay for the connections, etc., which Coleraine is not now paying for. So, in the wider economic sense, in the narrow sense, it's valuable for the locale, but in the wider sense, it still has the potential to disadvantage, doesn't it?
Well, just to come back to that point I made, that we would still be using the existing grid to a large extent to pull in wind off the system whenever turbines would otherwise be curtailed. So there will be that one-way traffic of energy into the microgrid on into the future, and it would actually allow more turbines to be built as well. And so when it's windy, those grids would be fully utilised in the way that they were originally intended to be used, and there's no real restrictions on that. So we would be sucking all that power into the microgrid and holding on to it. Then when the wind dies down, now we try and use it. You're right, at that point we wouldn't be just willy-nilly taking it off the grid. We would be using our own microgrid sourcing. And again, if we had excess energy stored up, we would want to export back out onto the grid between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock at night when the prices are high, and that would mean that Ballylumford and the other Kilroots of this world wouldn't have to carry so much spinning reserve for that peak in the evening. It would reduce the peak of generation in the evenings. And so those are some of the benefits that we give back to the main grid. I understand what you say, and there would be an element of those customers who find themselves not with the benefit of a microgrid would have to begin to shelter quite a bit of the running costs of the grid. It may not be as big an effect as first you think, and of course part of the feasibility studies will be to go into all of that and to define it and quantify it. At the moment it's all kind of conceptual, but if it did have the effect of putting electricity prices up, then all that would mean is that it makes it more viable for people to go down the microgrid route, and they could do that in the context of their own house as well. So, you know, companies like Bombardier have now decided that they should do this themselves and effectively form a microgrid. I don't know if they're calling it that, but that's effectively what they would be doing, is taking their energy provision into their own control. And other companies, if the electricity price continues to go up at 7.5% a year, which is much more than RPI, and you know our PPAs in a microgrid would be index linked for 20 years, and it's only RPI uplift, then you know more and more businesses would make the decision to go down that route, either on their own, in their industrial estate, or in their town.
But you're saying, in the absence of analysis, though, that there could be a big impact on the widest population, not on that microgrid. Notwithstanding what you're saying about the flows back and forward and work to be done and modelling, etc., but the concept of a Bombardier leaving has an impact. So the concept then of a load of people leaving has an impact on all of those that can't leave, because they don't have, you know, the connectability, the resource, whatever.
I think it's right to say that it is an impact. The impact, in our view, hasn't really been explored properly yet, and we need to see whether it's true to say that it will be a big impact.
No, but at the same time, I think these are important questions to answer, and you know, should they be answered first before the development of other systems? Shouldn't the modelling be done first to allow people to make confident decisions? Because, and this was the discussion we had last week, that you know that if it's government's responsibility to look after the widest population, ensure that the system's robust, both in terms of strength to take load and all the rest of it, but also that it's economically viable for as many people as possible. So opening the doors for everybody to take the low-hanging fruit, if you like, and that's a pejorative term, but you know what I mean. That in other words, pejorative in this sense, but that allows people just to take advantage for themselves. It would still leave, from a social justice perspective, if you like, swathes of the population unable to make decisions but faced with a bill.
Yeah. I mean, I accept that there needs to be a lot of analysis done, and it needs all of the sections of society to become involved in that. The only way we see to do it is through pilot projects and to try and use the project environment to flesh all this out, and all of the approvals that we would need to go through allow everybody to sort of ask those questions and get the answers that they need to see. That industry certainly is minded now to go down this route, and of course, you know, they do have a social agenda, but it's not one that is perhaps at the top of their list.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, thanks, Chair.
Right. Gordon?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much for coming in. Moving on slightly, NIE, I understand, are issuing revised heat maps, something that we have heard a lot about, and the need for them. What's your opinion in relation? Do you think that they will help decision making for developers in the future in relation to projects?
Well, the heat map is really a visual representation of the modelling that NIE does on their system to show what effect there would be on voltage and thermal ratings whenever generators are applied or not applied. So rather than having to ask NIE every single time about every single case, the heat map's been a very good, useful tool for developers to say, well, actually, because of the colour on the heat map, I can make a decision without having to ask NIE. So it's saving time and effort on both NIE's part and on the developers' parts, I would say. I think it's... I mean, most developers have to recognise that they take development risk, and there's no guarantees that your project would be built, and that there's a lot of hurdles that you have to get over. So they would have to come to understand the constraints that there are with regard to grid connection, and take a view as to whether they want to start developing any particular project. And the heat map is a very valuable tool with which they can begin to do site selection, should we say.
Yeah, what about your own experience with NIE? How have you found them in relation to renewable projects and making connections?
Well, we've worked with NIE for 20 odd years. All of our wind farms are connected to the NIE system in the north here. We've had a very good working relationship with them. We've sat on various committees together. And on the engineering point of view, we've had no difficulties with them. They limited the size of our wind farms right back at the beginning because they weren't sure what effect we would have on the voltage and the frequency. But the operating experience was that they didn't have such an adverse effect as they might have worried about, and so then they allowed the wind farms to be bigger in size. So I think the wind farming world is fine with it, because, you know, all of the clustering new substations out of the reinforcements out in the west and everything to bring on the big wind farms is a well-established process that's working very well. I don't think there's, well, there may be some people who have issues with it, but I think generally speaking it's happening very well. I think the problem that I've noticed is that when you come down to the smaller farm scale devices and you're trying to connect a kV network, where because it's dumb and blind, there's no monitoring or control, then NIE always runs a risk that the voltage may rise above the statutory limit if there's too much wind at a time when there's not enough load. So typically a summer's night, you would find that there's a big risk that the statutory limit would be exceeded, and they're not allowed to tolerate that happening. So that's the background to why it is. But you know, the solutions aren't simple either. In some cases, the connections can be done straight away. In other cases, you would have to put the turbine next to an existing load, like a dairy farm or a chicken farm or something, to try and provide the balance. In other cases, and certainly on our Lecale microgrid project in County Down, where there is virtually no prospect of a cost-effective grid connection anytime soon, and yet the airfield at Ballyhornan could have up to 30 megawatts of solar PV, very good solar resource. Landowners want to do it. government incentives in place, targets are there to be met, but they can't do it because of no grid, then rather than export the power from the site, what we're proposing to do is bring the load into the site and establish chicken farms, fish farms, hydroponics.
On the site?
On the site, bring new industry in, agro-industry in, that would provide
At
the
Bishop's
load.
Court?
Bishop's Court. So lighting, heating, ventilation, pumping of water, all that takes electricity, and we build up the electricity at the same time as building up the new businesses. And that's really because we're not able to go on to 11 kV network with microgrids.
Okay, and what would you do with any surplus there of electricity, just briefly, on that project?
We would put it into very large hot water tanks, probably. And
You would use it all?
we'd use that in the fish tanks, chicken houses and the hydroponic tanks. And actually we would also hook up to the housing developments in Ballyhornan there and provide them with heat as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Right, Fergal?
Oh yeah, can I just look at the storage issue again? Obviously there's the economics argument we touched on around storage, but in practical terms, how effective is, for example, compressed air storage compared to battery?
There's several types of compressed air energy storage. There's a very big project being done at Millbrook in Larne by Gay Electric, who's a wind farm developer, and that's using salt caverns. There's a surface compressor which compresses air into the ground and into the cavern which they make, and then that air comes out and goes through a gas turbine to generate electricity. So there is gas being consumed, but overall, because of the compressors are running at the time when wind farms are running, then it is an environmental benefit to do a project like that. But it's constrained to only be put where the salt reservoirs are,
Yes.
and so it can't be put anywhere. The more versatile technology we've decided to focus on is called isothermal compressed air, and that's technology which is emerging now from California. And it's very small scale, but it's modular, and it can be like Lego bricks. You can build it up into whatever size you want. You can put it at power stations, you can put it at substations, you can put it at end users, in whatever configuration you need, in order to get round the bottlenecks on the grid and avoid grid upgrading. So the constraints rather than curtailment now we're talking about. Basically it's a device which is a compressor expander, and when the wind is blowing it runs as a compressor and it compresses air into a tank. What it also does is store the heat of compression, and this is typically where inefficiency creeps in compressed air. So it stores the heat of compression in a hot water tank or warm water tank. And then later in the day, 4 to 8 at night, the unit becomes an expander, and it takes the air, and the expander drives a generator and you export onto the grid. And now, whereas it would freeze into a block of ice, you use your warm water to prevent that from happening. So there's 95% thermodynamic efficiency, and it means that you're getting very high return trip electrical efficiencies, around about 60–65%. If you locate next to a waste heat source and you make the warm water into hot water, you can actually increase the efficiency further, and that's something which we're looking at doing trials at Lecale and at Coleraine with isothermal compressed air. There's adiabatic compressed air as well, which allows the temperature to rise up to 400 degrees C. You still store the heat, but you're storing it in molten salt rather than in warm water. Just different technologies. They're both competing against each other to get to market first, and we're talking to both of them. The projections are that the cost of energy storage through that method would be about half the price of electrical chemical batteries. And it has the beauty of that you disassociate power with energy storage. For instance, in a battery, if you want more energy storage, you have to have more power. Or if you want more power, you have to have more storage capacity. They're inextricably linked to each other. Whereas with this, you have the compressor expander, which is your power unit, and you can make that whatever size you want. And then your energy store is just tanks and pipes underneath the ground, and you can make as many of those if you like. And it's very important for us to match the storage capacity with the length of time that the wind farms would run for, and they can run for 24 hours at full power. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. And you know, it's no good your batteries being charged up after 1 hour or 2 hours. What are you going to do then? You'll still have to curtail the turbines anyway. So we need something you can just keep running it hour after hour after hour. Isothermal compressed air allows you to do that. Then the energy comes back as electricity. If you have electrode boilers, you can do it hour after hour after hour, but you're making hot water. It can never come back really as electricity. You need a load for the hot water at that point.
I have no concept about the scale of this in terms of how big. You've said you can make it as big, but how small could a unit be that would be still effective in terms of delivering hours of electricity?
The current technology is using reciprocating compressors. A 500 kilowatt unit would be in a 20-foot container. So if you need 2 megawatts, you need 4 20-foot containers.
So it's transportable. You could take that energy in compressed format to a site which doesn't have a wind farm and power something there?
Well, in theory you could, but in practice you wouldn't do that. No, you would establish the power units where the grid needs them to be, where you need the load and where you need the generation.
Yeah, but what if you had an area... Well, sorry, why wouldn't you if you had an area that didn't have... well, you need to offload the extent of power that you've saved.
Yeah.
You have another area that doesn't have a wind farm and has a weakened grid. Why wouldn't you transport it?
You transport the compressed air?
No, if it's the size of a 20-foot trailer, why couldn't you put it on the back of a trailer with its compressed air storage potential in it and take it to somewhere that needs it?
Wouldn't be efficient.
You would just put another one where... These are distributed, you put them all over the place. Wherever the grid needs it, you would put a new one.
Okay.
Travel on the grid.
But from what you're saying, some form of the compressed air is the more efficient system for both storage and return of energy at a higher level in terms of loss.
Yes, the projections are that it would be more efficient and cheaper. Now, I have to say that you can't go and buy them today. They're still being developed, but there's an awful lot of money being spent on doing that. Energy storage is one of the key things for the future of the renewables industry and our whole effort to combat climate change, so it must be a success.
And it may answer some of the issues around what we were talking about earlier in terms of microgrid, because that's your return valve. Like that's your return to the system.
Yes, it's just like a big spring, really, storing up energy.
Thank you, Chair.
Stephen?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, David. Over the years, been very impressed with B9. You know, it's great to see, because obviously I'm somebody who tries to promote the renewables industry, but a local company actually showing that we can do it here. It doesn't have to be something, you know, you mentioned the 10 wind farms that you've developed, and now obviously the first offshore project being part of that consortium, and now the microgrids as well. So you're a local company involved in innovation in a global industry, which is great to see, and great to see you are successful in doing so. The microgrid idea, I think this is quite new to us as a committee, and I think we're still getting our heads around some of the ramifications of it. Everything to date that we've looked at has been about the big grid, interconnector being the huge issue, but even sort of projecting forward the idea of a Europe-wide interconnected grid. Does this in any way run contrary to that, or do you see both things needing to happen simultaneously? Is this an alternative? We just have a series of microgrids, we don't need that interconnection because we have much more localised containment, or should the two be operating in tandem?
I think they are complementary, and they would operate in tandem and become part of a new hybrid system where you need the large-scale grid for large-scale transportation from big central power stations, which in theory we still need because of inertia in the system and to keep the frequency correct. There may be ways around that in the future, but they're pretty embryonic at the moment. So, you know, you need to be able to connect to the old style of centralised generation and have access to market for those power stations. But at the same time, the way that renewables are coming up now, a lot of them are very small scale, distributed, and you may as well deploy those. After you've done energy efficiency properly, you may as well deploy those and use that locally, because then you don't incur any of the I²R losses from transmission distances. And so the losses, the efficiencies would be better if you used it locally from the point of view of losses. But the small scale generators aren't by and large as efficient as the big ones are. I mean, large wind turbines are very much more cost effective than small wind turbines.
So when you say centralised power, and I suppose I was thinking fossil fuel generators, but would you even consider a large wind farm in some degree to be a centralised form of power?
They are becoming now. If you look at a large offshore wind farm, it would connect into the 275,000 volt network and sit alongside conventional power stations.
Okay. So even if we move away from the fossil fuel generators to, in the future, 100% renewables or whatever, you're still going to need the large interconnected grid?
Yes, and it would still be needing to use it in the conventional sense that it was designed for, the one-way traffic from the large central generation down to the extremities of the customer base. The difficulty is when those customers try to send the power back up the other way and the transformer's not designed for reverse power flowing. That's the difficulty. And, you know, we just have to try and understand all of that and allow for it and try and remove the problem areas and create new value at the same time. And in a funny sort of a way, out of the mist, these microgrids are beginning to look like they could do that, you know. And we just need to get some projects done so we can really get into the nitty-gritty and find out what the problems might be for commercial deployment. And as a developer, what we've always done with any project is say, well, what would stop this project? And you have to find that as soon as possible so that you can give up and not waste your time or your money. And so far, we've not come up against any showstoppers on microgrids.
Okay. Well, just in terms of your own projects then in microgrids, what do you see? Which is the most advanced? Which one's likely to come to fruition first? Is that the Lacal project, or you mentioned Coleraine, or you sort of said you have to get one off the ground almost to see for the others what goes right and what's wrong. Is there any of them are particularly further ahead? Or?
No, they're all running fairly well in parallel. I'd like to get them all done because we've chosen different sorts of them.
Okay.
We've got large rural, large urban, small urban, and a sort of domestic level thing.
Okay.
And trying to get all of those so that the representation of the market
pilot
sector.
in its own right, sort of thing?
Yes, and some of them will be more potent than others. But I could just say that the success of which one of these will be successful first, in my view, depends on how much drive there comes from the other stakeholders in the project. And certainly when you look at Coleraine Council, who's driving the microgrid up there, they'd be, in my view, the most proactive of the councils in Northern Ireland. And they see that to try and bolster the enterprise zone status which they have now with low-cost electricity, which is greener in an environmental audit and which has longer-term price security, are all good things which would provide a differentiator within the enterprise zone arena.
You mentioned kind of rural, and it kind of comes back to Fergal's point. You described it as a win-win our concern is internally within the microgrid it's win-win and everybody externally is lose, and,
Yeah.
and you've kind of touched on that. Is this more difficult to do, would you anticipate, in a rural area where you maybe have, certainly I suppose maybe I'm thinking very much domestic, but you have a more dislocated population, and you maybe don't have those in an area, for example, where you don't have maybe a big industry? Could we see the scenario, is it a possible scenario where we have microgrids for urban and industrialised areas and rural areas actually then paying the cost of the larger grid, central grid?
Well, it's very difficult to comment on costs still, but there is a problem in the rural context if NIE continue not to allow microgrids to adopt part of the 11 kV network. Because then really farms or agro-industrial plants like creameries and things that you find out in the countryside would be fairly stranded. They'd be on their own, and they would have to provide their own generation. It would be more like a sort of self-generation situation. And it's only if fortuitously the neighbour had a wind turbine that they could hook up to. If you had a lot of people dotted around wanting to join into that microgrid, they would all have to live next to each other so that the private line which goes from one property to the next would be uninterrupted. It'd be much more difficult to see how it could completely satisfy the rural demand. But of course, it's early days in this, and I would fully expect that NIE at some point in time, along with other DNOs in GB and in the Republic of Ireland, would simply jump onto this and start doing it, you know, and they would bring about projects which utilise their networks in this intelligent way. I mean, it's not a technical challenge really, because that level of monitoring control is present at 33 kV. It's never been seen as something that was ever needed in the first place, and then was justified because it's a small number of very small generators at the end of the day compared with the big wind farm situation. So it's a cost that somebody, and an effort that somebody has to go to, that no one at the moment is particularly minded to embrace. But that, you know, will change, I think.
Okay. Finally, just to come back, I think it was Paul or somebody mentioned it before, the issue of ownership. I think when UFU presented, when they were talking about the Hill, they were talking about the existing infrastructure that was there, effectively using what's there. How much is this about developing new infrastructure, and how much of it is about developing the existing infrastructure? And I suppose in both cases, using the NIE's infrastructure or developing your own, you said they would NIE and Sony would be the owner or operator. How does that work? I'm just not sure about kind of ownership and who pays and who runs the grid ultimately, because we're just used to NIE and Sony, and we kind of understand that, and this is different.
Yes, and the existing situation is, for instance, on a wind farm, if we built a wind farm with its own substation on top of a hill, and then we had to put in 5 kilometres of new line to get to an existing point of NIE system where we could either tee into a line or connect to the substation, then our wind farm project would have to pay for the wind turbines, the substation, and the new line all the way down. We would develop it, it would be our cost. But from the point of common coupling at the substation on the wind farm, the NIE side of that, with its protection units and its transformers and all the rest of it, all of that would be handed over as an asset to NIE. So it comes into NIE's ownership, and they're responsible for the maintenance of it. It's their asset, but we happen to pay for it in the first place. And that would be true of any infrastructure on a microgrid that was at 33 or 11 kV, in my view. It would the way the regulations are, they're the body which is tasked with keeping health and safety correct, and they would have to do that. And you can't argue with the regulations on health and safety with electrical. It's very dangerous stuff. Now, so the project would pay for it, but it would go into somebody else's ownership in the fullness of time. Now, some of these pieces of cables and wires, though, if they're going across boundaries of stakeholders, they can be private ownership.
Okay.
They're behind the meter. It's just like if you're in your house, you wanted to run some extra cables down to the bottom of your garden for a summer house or something. You can do that, and you don't have to tell NIE about it. You've got your meter, you've got your fuses, and everything's okay. And same would be like a large industrial complex could put in new load, new generation, and as long as it's all protected by the G59 relays for under voltage, under frequency and rate of change of frequency, then any fault that you might create, the grid is protected.
Okay.
And so, for instance, at the Antrim Hospital, there's a wind turbine, it's 500 kilowatts. Everything it generates is absorbed in the hospital. It never exports onto the grid, so their grid connection didn't really have to change.
So is it just then when it hits the substation? Is that the point, or the NIE? I'm just still trying to understand when IE says this is ours now. You know, so you can run between two houses. Used the example previously, two neighbouring farmhouses or whatever. That can be done privately.
Yeah.
It's when you, I suppose, it's essentially when you connect into the main grid, and there might be two-way connection. Is that
11 kV? I think
11
would be
kV.
the threshold. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, just on that wee quick query, there was an issue around dual connections, particularly for farmers who had a generator, a turbine, and there was this issue around, well, you can't have two connections, one grid connection and then a connection from another source, because of health and safety reasons, and because of something has to be isolated, and obviously there's still a live feed there. Has that been resolved? It's not so much about the ownership, but it was the issue about health and safety, because that was an issue at the time. Now, the Ulster Farmers Union told us last week that was actually resolved, but I'm not sure how it was resolved or when it was resolved.
I don't really have any experience of that. I know that the farming world had to make a separation between farming activity and non-farming activity in order to track
The
growth.
same principles will apply here. If you have another grid and it's going in and out of housing and factories or whatever load, and it's a dual connection compared to the ordinary grid, difference, you would still have that same health and safety aspect.
Oh yes, absolutely. But the responsibility for the health and safety would rely with the microgrid company on the private network side, behind the NIE meter. And then the point of transferring of responsibility is at the G59 panel or the point of common coupling to the grid. That's how the health and safety would be demarked. Both parties have to comply with the grid code and all other relevant regulations.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Phil.
Can I ask just a quick question? I'm sorry for having to nip in and out. David, what's the utility operator or utility operator's position in this whole thing? Have they an opinion? Has she an opinion?
I think that they're generally supportive of the view that microgrids have a potential to provide some benefits and to solve some problems, and that they're open to supporting proposals that come forward in any way they can. I mean, I know that there has been a series of conferences in recent years on microgrids in Belfast called Acumen that have been very well attended by distribution network operators from GB, for instance. Very high profile event, and that the regulator's office was present at that last year. And we heard presentations from microgrid operators in New York City and in Austria, I think, and Denmark, and that, you know, all the people that were there were thinking this. There is something in this. So, you know, I'm sure that it's like everything else and everybody else, it's still early days, and we're all just trying to understand, you know, how to get this thing to move in a way which suits everybody, and that there's only winners and that there isn't really any losers, you know, because otherwise if there's people who lose out, then there's fights and disagreements, and that's counterproductive to getting where we need to be, which is a much higher penetration of renewables on the system, so that we can meet our targets and exceed our targets and help to solve the climate change.
I think I said utility operator, I meant a utility regulator, and you picked up on that. But do you hope to have any more conversation as this rolls out, as you bring this forward, with the utility regulator?
Yes,
and you say there that she's sympathetic to this and in this process as a way forward. But how much more conversation do you hope to have there?
Well, the next opportunity actually will be provided the Coleraine Council approves the strategy document that we've produced for the Council. Then we would be tasked with socialising that report to the various stakeholders, the industrial people, commercial people, residents associations in Coleraine, but we would also go to the regulator, NIE, and other people who would have a bearing on the successful outcome of the project. And that socialising of the report would be a two-way discussion really with the regulator. It would be to say what we feel could be done based on the examples coming from Germany in particular and Denmark, with our take on the opportunities that are present on the ground in Coleraine, and some of the shortcomings that we foresee already and the barriers to doing this that we identify, and then let them come back to us with more questions. And you know, in the next steps is to do technical and commercial feasibilities, and we need to populate a whole big list of tasks that the feasibility study would undertake, and the regulator is very welcome to, you know, define a lot of the challenges and the questions that we need to ask ourselves, and you know, that's consultation really, you could say.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Jenna. David, can you tell us a wee bit more about Project 40? Farmers Union raised it with us last week, and I think it's something that members would like to gain a better insight into.
Yeah, I've not had any direct involvement with Project 40, and I don't actually know the full technical details of it. Like you, I think I've more heard it second-hand through Ulster Farmers Union, who are involved in the project. Okay. From the outside, it looks to me as if it's really a question of curtailing the wind turbine, the smaller embedded generating turbine, which of course in any microgrid situation that involves those machines, if you get to the point where you haven't got a load that you can put onto the grid to make the balance happen, then you must curtail the wind turbine. So every microgrid will have a piece of logic that says switch the turbines off. Self-curtailment will be in it. So Project 40 looks like it's saying, okay, well, let's just do that bit of a microgrid logic where if the voltage rises up to some threshold, then you can switch it off. And that would be a welcome step forward. It would allow some more turbines to have connectivity. Whether or not it goes far enough to satisfy all of the farmers who are currently, you know, stranded, then it remains to be seen.
Okay. In terms of the project in Larne, how far advanced is it?
Larne is applying at the moment for to do a scoping study through the INI's Collaborative Network Programme. So the stakeholders involved, which is several factories there, would apply for funding to form a collaborative network, and that gives a background piece of money to start looking at how the project could be defined. Right. And it would pay for some days of consultancy in each of the factories to look at the load profiles and all of the energy usage patterns and things, and look at beginning to flesh out how long the cable would be, what storage methods would be used. A fundamental question is, do you want to have autonomous capability? You know, we heard from the regulator in DETI a few months back that, you know, on the 1st of January 2016, when there's a change in the situation at Ballylumford with 3 final sets going into retirement, there's a restriction at Kilroot due to the Large Combustion Directive. The North-South interconnector won't be live yet, and the Moyle may still be running on 50% capacity. Then the reserve generation in Northern Ireland would be pretty thin, and that they're saying that there's a higher risk of having blackouts. Now, if you're an agri-food company and you've got, you know, fridges full of lorry loads of meat and stuff, you can't afford to have outages like that. So a microgrid can be designed to operate autonomously, so that if the main grid has a blackout, then you open the breaker where you connect onto the main grid, and the microgrid can be kept live, and it would have its own diesel generator backup as well as batteries and things to ride through the period that the main grid is blacked out. So we would be trying to get those definitions into the LARN specification fairly soon now.
Okay. David, thanks very much. We might have some written questions at a later stage. Would you be happy enough to answer those in written format if we send you some?
Yep.
All right. Thanks a million.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Paul?
I think that's been very, very useful, very, very good. And again, it's still all very primitive with regards to the technology and where it can go and what it can do for us. Could I ask, is it in order that we as a committee ask for research around the types of microgrid? There was 3 mentioned there: island microgrid, the grid tie, and then using the existing 11 kV system. I think it would be useful to have that and actually build a wee bit of education around for ourselves. I do think also, could we ask for research around the storage of electricity systems? Because again, that was David mentioned that too with regards to the different types of storage, and I think there's question marks around the feasibility of storage at this time also. Second request then is, could we ask for... Was that?
Third one.
Sorry, third. Slightly different then. Could we ask for at least a written brief from the utility regulator on all of this? Because I think nothing can really happen until we know what her position is and also the position of Sony in all of this. And then also, could we ask for a written brief from Korean Council as to what they do or what they're trying to do?
Is there a visit in it to Lacal? Not too much.
Yeah, either Lacal or Korean, depending on what one's economy of scale.
Well, is there anything to see at this stage?
Well, that's what I don't know. I don't know if there's
how
anything
far
to see.
advanced the LARN thing was, that maybe that could be the
Yeah,
place to go, but I don't think any of them are far enough advanced.
if we ask for even written briefs at this point, I don't want to burden the workload of the committee by asking for oral briefs, so if we can get a written brief even at this point.
Written briefing from Korean Council.
Korean Council, obviously there's
And written briefings from the utility regulator and Sony, would that be?
yeah, that would be in order, if that's okay with the members.
Yep, and if I can add to that, on the energy storage issue, I don't know if it's something we'd have to write directly to the Environment Committee, or if we could just ask our own researcher to work with their researcher to look at the environmental impacts of some of the energy storage. I know there's some concerns with the compressed air storage proposals in the salt mines, if that could be included in any research.
Yeah, because I could be out of order here, but has that not been shelved or at least delayed?
My understanding is, no, I'm actually meeting Gale Electric soon. I had a phone conversation with them, but to get an update. But as far as I can gather, they're applying for permissions and.
Right. Okay.
See all this information you're looking for, Paul, is that for the review, or is that just to better inform members? So you don't want it included as part of the review?
No, because the review is something else.
Yeah.
The review was something else. But we've found this wee piece of information that we need to explore out of the work we've done. But this in itself will grow legs as technology develops. So this will be above and beyond the review that's currently on board. So if that takes the pressure off.
Quite right as well, isn't it? Members content to move on? Agenda item number 5 is an oral briefing from the Consumer Council on postal issues, and papers for this item are at page 23 onwards, and you have a paper from the Consumer Council and a news article at page 33. Briefing the committee today are Cathy and Gellin from Consumer Council. So you're both very welcome. I do believe your name is it Keelan or Kellen? Keelan. Keelan. I just spelled it wrong here. You're both very welcome. Do you just want to give an opening presentation here and see what the story is?
Thank you. We'd like to thank the committee very much for the opportunity for the Consumer Council to come and speak with you today. The Consumer Council took on the role to represent postal service consumers from the 1st of April 2014, and the role was previously conducted by Consumer Futures Post. Because we are very new to the role, we do welcome this early engagement with the committee, because we want to know what the areas that you believe are important, so that can inform our work. It's also important that we get this early engagement because we're starting our business planning for 15-16, so we'd be interested to know your views. And we're glad to tell you that we very recently got confirmation of the transfer from Citizens Advice to the Consumer Council to handle postal service complaints in Northern Ireland. So at the minute we're working really hard on the knowledge transfer for our staff and also in setting up the systems and procedures. So we will be making that announcement to the public in due course once we're all set up and ready to go. So postal services are a reserved matter, but they are really but they have great local importance and significance. And there's two separate elements to our work. One is the post office network, and the second is mail and parcel services. So in the briefing, you've had the opportunity to read about what we think are the areas of key focus. One of those areas is about transforming post offices in local areas. And when Post Office propose a change to a post office, we have a role as a statutory consultee to make sure that the consumer voice is heard and that any implications for consumers are taken on board. With regards to parcels, traditional mail is declining, but we are seeing the growth in parcel deliveries. And you maybe have all experienced it. Whenever you're shopping online, you go to the checkout, there's a surcharge for Northern Ireland consumers, or perhaps the retailer in question won't even deliver to consumers in Northern Ireland. So we do believe that there's an area of detriment there that needs to be addressed. We also think that there's a huge opportunity for post offices to address financial inclusion. By the end of this year, we'll have seen 27% of high street branches being taken off the high street. Now, our research shows that 68% of consumers use their bank branches on at least a monthly basis. So we do think that there's potentially something more that post offices can be offering, and we're keen to explore that. Obviously, universal service obligation is very important to small businesses and vulnerable consumers in particular. Increasing prices are always of concern, so it's important that value for money is maintained and that there is a good quality of service. And I suppose the last area that worth a brief mention is that of cross-border mail. We know it's an area of particular relevance and interest to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and it is an area that we intend to do some work.
But that was short.
Well, I was trying to keep it brief.
Fair play. He's making a public announcement. When is it, next week?
No, it's in due course. We just want to make sure that we've got all the systems in place, because we don't want to be telling consumers, and the area is particularly for vulnerable consumers. It's going to be a signposting role for consumers in general, but where consumers are vulnerable or need a little bit of extra help, that's whenever we can take the complaint on their behalf and investigate it to conclusion. So we want to make sure that our staff are all trained up, all skilled with the relevant knowledge, and our computer systems are in place.
And is there a dedicated phone line for that, or just through the General Consumer Council helpline?
It is the General Consumer Council helpline, so it does fit with our other statutory areas where we can handle complaints.
Okay. In terms of cross-border postal services, you're going to do a bit of, you're going to explore the issue this year. What kind of things he's going to be looking at?
Sorry, we're going to be looking at how competition is developing. As you know, cross-border mail, most consumers and small businesses still use Royal Mail services here because competition is fairly much in its infancy. But it is developing, it is a new market. There is European initiatives that are in place to help support cross-border parcels right across Europe, and this will also filter out between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. It's to help improve interoperability so that basically the speed of the delivery can happen faster. What we will be seeing is that we want to investigate how this market is developing. Does it meet consumer needs? We know it's slow at the moment. What more can be done? We recognise that the mail market is decreasing, but the parcel market is increasing. Does more focus need to be on the parcel market to perhaps increase trade between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland?
And he's going to engage with customers, or is it just merely a desktop exercise at looking at the levels of competition?
Well, it's still very much in its infancy, but I would envisage that we will be doing a lot of quantitative and qualitative research, both with consumers and businesses. I think particularly businesses feel the brunt of this quite substantially more than consumers, because they have alternative means, electronic means. They can phone, they can text, but businesses are still very much reliant on the postal system, and any research that we do, that seems to come out quite clearly.
Okay, and in terms of access to banking services, I know it's one of the issues that I've suggested the All-Party Group and Postal Services look at, is the range of banking services and the range of banks that work with post office branches. Is that something that you are going to look at in the near future?
Yes. We want to do a piece of research regarding consumers' views about using post offices for those services. At the minute, the services are limited, but it is important for, as I mentioned in the introduction, 68% of domestic consumers are using a bank branch at least once a month for transactions. Now, we need to get a clear understanding of what those transactions actually are. Is it always necessary for them to be going into a branch, or is there ways in which that they can be skilled to move on to online banking? But some consumers will always want to visit a branch or a physical access point because, well, we've had the security issues and the IT glitches, so addressing that customer confidence is one issue. But also for the business sector, businesses have to use bank branches for lodgements, for getting change, and we know that in one area in Northern Ireland, they have no bank branches left, and this is not only impacting on the convenience of those local businesses, but it's also affecting footfall for those businesses, so they're noticing a decline in their trade. So it is of strategic importance, and we believe that where post offices remain in local communities, that there is an opportunity there.
There's a move on through the post office to put post offices now inside retail stores to reduce the overheads and to give them extended open hours. What are consumers telling you about that change? Are they happy with that rollout?
Well, I think that's about sustainability of the network as well, and for each one of those changes there is a wide consumer consultation exercise. We were recently involved in quite a contentious one in the Armagh area, and there was quite a huge campaign to try by consumers to try to prevent the existing location being changed, and the move was into a well-established local kind of supermarket business. And I suppose, well, in our view, Post Office Limited weren't initially taken on board consumers' concerns and the reasons why consumers were opposing this move. So we went down into the community and worked with a number of the elected representatives there as well, and really tried to understand what the consumers' views were. Now, Post Office Limited made their decision, the move was happening. but we escalated that. So although we don't have power to veto on their decision, we can really make the consumer voice heard. As a result of our interaction, one of the concerns of the local consumers was accessibility. You know, the parking was limited, and it was more congested in the town. We managed to secure free parking for the first 6 months for post office users in the new store. That was unprecedented. That's never happened before, so that was a major win. We also managed within this store to get an independent disability access audit done because we were concerned about the store layout, also about entering and exiting the store. People with restricted mobility, it may have been more difficult. And actually, the new operator has found that all to be a very positive experience. So although we don't have power of veto, we have made a significant difference, and there's now greater buy-in from that local community as a result of the work that we've done. Do you want to add anything?
I suppose on the generic issue, the sustainability of the post office has to be balanced with consumer view. We have to take the view that to make post office sustainable, they have to be within a retail outlet. So what we do on each individual case, as Cathy has mentioned, we take consumers' views into account, and it is done at an individual level. Where customers have raised their concerns, we make sure that post office address these. But it has to be balanced with the future of the network, and the future of the network is within the retail store, and to make it more of a nimble organisation, that it can respond to competitive pressures, that it can bid with the likes of PayPoint and be competitive with tenders.
But what kind of an overall view are you getting from consumers about post office branches moving into retail stores? Are they generally happy enough about it?
In most cases, they're moving on site, so generally the customers don't actually see any difference. It's more of a change with the contractual arrangements with the sub-postmaster. But where they are moving into a retail premises, some initial research has told us that some of them had difficulties with privacy issues. They didn't like perhaps collecting their pension where people were paying for petrol, because a lot of these were in petrol stations with supermarkets. But we have worked with Post Office, and they've put in dedicated counters for the post office that separate, increased privacy screens, where they can. We've worked around a lot of these issues where they have been raised.
And what about access to training for retail staff? Because I've had some complaints that in some areas where the post office has moved inside a retail store, that not all the staff have been trained properly in how to do all of the post office services. Is that a problem that you have encountered?
It is a problem we've encountered, and we've continuously raised it with Post Office Limited. They have a very extensive training programme in place, but what we're hearing from operators is that it doesn't actually roll down to their staff. It is something that we will continuously take up with Post Office and make sure that as these models rolled out, staff are trained.
So is the problem with the Post Office as opposed to the retail franchisee, whoever's taken on the licence?
Well, Post Office do provide the training, but in many cases, in terms of these retail outlets, it's it would be it's not actually a dedicated Post Office agent. It's somebody that works behind the retail counter. So, as you know, the labour turnover can increase, and you have to keep training your staff. So that isn't always the case. So what we will be doing, and it's actually this year, we will be following up on a number of post office changes to follow up things like training, how well customers felt that they were dealt with by staff, were they knowledgeable, and we will continually bring this up with Post Office to make sure that they're putting even further measures in place to make sure these training issues are resolved.
Okay, thanks for that. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Just wanted to ask, on your paper under Section 2, you mentioned Northern Ireland consumers have not yet witnessed the full benefits of competition. What was meant by that?
Well, in comparison, that would be in comparison to other areas in GB. Northern Ireland is very heavily rural. It's a very heavy rural density, if I can say that. So competition tends to take place in places where there is a high density of population, because it is more profitable for them to do that. We have some competition in place here. The likes of TNT do postal access agreements. There is also some competition that exists in the parcel market, like Nightline, but it's very much in its infancy at the moment. It isn't as fully developed as it would be in London, Birmingham, etc. It's because of the density of population in Northern Ireland. But that's not to say it might change going forward. But it isn't one of the places that the likes of the larger postal operators are targeting first, because it probably wouldn't be the most profitable for them.
Is it your assessment, and maybe it's not for you to make an assessment, though, that the competition has been of benefit overall? You know, and bearing in mind the public service obligation, if that's the right term, of a universal service, i.e., as you've pointed out, the highly densely-rated areas, the competition comes in, they take the profitable business, and the unprofitable business is left for us to fund, or for Royal Mail to fund, whatever way their new structures work.
Well, it is showing benefits for, well, competition obviously only applies to businesses. Essentially, it doesn't apply to the residential consumers. So where it is in place, those business customers are seeing the benefit. They're seeing lower postal costs, in some cases improved delivery. So it is driving the market in terms of that, but we are, at the moment, we're still very heavily reliant on the universal service obligation. Northern Ireland benefit greatly from that, in that we have a uniform tariff to anywhere in the United Kingdom. So to us at the moment, the universal service obligation is fundamentally important, and it's something we keep an eye on quite closely.
Tied to that, then, the issue of the parcels coming from GB and the operators who don't have the single pricing structure. I've been one of those customers who's cancelled an order because I've seen, in one case it was quite a large delivery, £25 added to my bill, and I thought, well, thank you, but it's fine. There's some kind of mention in your paper of progress being made. Is there a new voluntary approach taking place whereby companies are starting to take this into account? And if so, does that mean they're starting to cross-subsidise within their own business?
It's actually a good opportunity for us to maybe raise. You will have got an annex at the back about the Statement of Principles.
Yeah.
This is actually a UK-agreed Statement of Principles between online retailers, parcel delivery operators and consumer organisations, including ourselves. We've done some work on this. And what this is it's providing a very basic guide to retailers who want to trade online, how they can meet their legal obligations, but also how they can reduce delivery detriment to people in rural areas, Northern Ireland, Highland Islands and Scotland. This was originally developed by the Scottish Government, and then it was adopted by the UK Government. It has been published, but what we would like to see in Northern Ireland is the Northern Ireland Assembly's endorsement of these UK Statement of Principles. It needs to be raised further, because Northern Ireland suffer greatly as a nation of the UK in terms of these parcel delivery detriments. You know, as you said, there's 2/3 of consumers have abandoned carts at some stage. So, you know, it is an issue that we're looking into. But the parcel market is unregulated, as is the e-retail market. So there can't be any regulations imposed on this. So it is all through voluntary codes of practice. Just yesterday, the Consumer Council attended a roundtable session with e-retailers and parcel operators and other consumer organisations in London to develop this issue, because it isn't an issue just based to Northern Ireland. It is, the solutions have to be found at a UK level, because most of the e-retailers are based in GB, actually. So what we're finding is that there is a willingness for this situation to improve, but what we were trying to do is put in voluntary codes of practice, also perhaps introduce things like trust marks for retailers, that when a customer sees a trust mark, they know that it can be a guaranteed delivery at a uniform price. So there is, it's a moving situation, it's a dynamic and growing market, and technology and the market is moving faster than regulation or even we're trying to keep up with.
And that's what I was going to ask. It sounds like you're pushing for a voluntary code because regulation isn't not an option. Is that the case?
That's the case, and e-retailers and parcel operators obviously do not want further regulation. It doesn't allow them to be flexible in this changing market.
And even if we looked at a European level, would it be something that could realistically put in place in terms of regulation, or because of its international nature, is it just outside the bounds of regulation?
It is outside the bounds of regulation. The European Commission are actually looking at parcels, cross-border parcels, that improving the trade between in the single market. They see parcel delivery across borders as a barrier to trade. So it is something they're looking at the moment, but because it is an unregulated market, there is, and the universal service obligation is in place, there is this option for retailers and consumers to use this uniform tariff. And in the statement of principles, we have alluded to where there isn't an unreasonable price for a delivery to Northern Ireland or Highlands of Islands of Scotland, that a retailer should offer the universal service obligation product so that customers still have access to an affordable parcel delivery.
Okay, thank you.
William?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. Recently, Danske Bank, for example, made an announcement of a number of closures of branches, one of them in the Shankill Road in the constituency I represent. And I met with the bank and I met with the post office. It just so happened as well that the post office were closing a branch that was serving sort of the mid-Shankill exactly almost in the same stretch or block as the bank. And I managed to get the bank and the post office together and so on. What sort of role can you guys play in that type of scenario where particularly older people, because the footfall in the bank is quite high, but I guess in terms of the volume of people compared to the amount of money being lodged or whatever, the throughput in the bank doesn't justify a branch being there, they tell us. So what sort of role do you play there?
Well, we're not about to challenge the economic decisions of banks. What we do want to know, banks are telling us that they're seeing a growing number of transactions being performed online and less footfall in the bank. But one of our questions is, banks would perhaps, if somebody goes onto their phone and checks their balance 4 times in a day, that's 4 separate online transactions. So we just want there to be a bit more transparency and clarity around the reporting of online transactions versus bank closures. I think that whenever a bank does choose to withdraw from an area, it's quite difficult if that's the last bank standing. And what we would like, but because of commercial reasons, is a more strategic approach. But what we do think that could be achievable is by looking at alternative options. There's been a lot of work done, particularly in the northeast of England, with regards to community banking. We do feel that there is a greater role for the post office and also credit unions to be involved within credit unions, perhaps within the provision of personal current accounts. But that is going to also take a long time to work through. When a bank makes a decision to close or withdraw from an area, what we want to see is that there is clear communication to their customers, so that customers are given prior warning, that customers are given the option to switch bank accounts. There maybe is already an existing bank within the area, so that customers are given the skills and knowledge as to how that they can switch to another bank that maybe does have a physical presence in their area. We also would like banks to address perhaps legacy issues, things like ensuring that at the very least their free ATM machine remains within the area. We've heard recently of a number of closures where they've also taken away the ATM from the area, which causes further difficulty.
They gave a commitment to me that they would retain the ATM on the side of the bank, and even if they sell the building, they will retain it, which is good. But my concern is, older members of the community are not so trusting of things like ATMs, or if an ATM breaks down or all of that, or it runs out of money on a weekend, that leaves people snookered. One of the things they did work with me on, to be fair to them now, was working with sort of a month or 6 weeks before the bank actually was going to close. They committed to work with particularly older customers to bring them in terms of an education about, for example, they can make lodgements to that bank in the post office.
Yes. Yeah, we welcomed that. We thought that was a really good initiative, having those dedicated customer service sessions to provide their existing customer base with the information about how they can bank using alternative methods, or more information about their nearest location. So we want to work with banks to make sure that more of that goes on, but in the long term, strategically, we would like to see alternative options being explored, like community banking, like the use of post offices. I mean, if you can go into your local petrol station and pay for your petrol, diesel, tax your car, plus do your banking, kind of optimising on consumer
When you talk about
convenience.
community banking, are you talking about credit unions?
Well, credit unions would be within the model. There are some real innovations happening in the northeast of England. They're looking at perhaps entrepreneurs, people that are extremely wealthy, setting up their own banks and using the capital they have to fund community banks. So there are a range of options, but in GB there is a credit union modernisation fund, but the infiltration of credit unions in GB is something like 1%. In Northern Ireland, credit unions are used much more widely. It's about 30% of the Northern Ireland population have a credit union account. So we do think that more can be done, but of course we've got we've got the federation and the league, so there's two different models, and within each of those models, each branch is totally autonomous, and with that, the different branches have different levels of risk. So it's a very complicated area to try and encourage those branches to be doing more.
And I'm a member of a credit union, and I commend the work they do, but can I just ask you finally, in relation to the community banking, do you think there's scope for community banking that you talked about in terms of the north east of England being rolled out in Northern Ireland?
I think that we have to watch the emerging picture very closely. We've already lost 27% of the bank branches, so it is where we are at the place now where we need to really understand consumer behaviour, why they're using branches, and to make sure that there's alternative convenient options for that. If community banking can be provided through post offices and credit unions, we've already got two very successful models in place within our communities, so can we optimise on the services that they're providing to the community? So I think that we are at the infancy of exploring the options, but I think that we now need to grab this opportunity and make sure that we fully understand what consumer behaviour is, what their needs are, and also the business community, and making sure that we don't lose elements of convenience for consumers.
Yeah, because I think, just finally, I think we are, but potentially banks are increasingly being seen as something for business and large business in particular, and not necessarily becoming more distant from the ordinary person out in the street. And when you consider that when they came to your primary school and they give you a Henry Hippo, encourage you to I'm not so sure that that's sort of something which is happening now. Thank you.
And sorry if I could just respond to that. That feeds very much into the financial capability message as well as financial inclusion, and the two go hand in hand. We need to skill our young people to budget and to save, as well as to make sure that they're financially included to do so.
Thanks very much.
Rogo?
Yeah, just briefly, just following on from some of the remarks made earlier on. One of the arguments, among others, that the banks have used is that there is a lack of footfall. So in any of those areas where post offices have now set up with a banking facility, has the footfall proved the bank's argument to be right or wrong?
Well, I'm not sure we've got the evidence to respond to that, but certainly in one community where banks have withdrawn, those local businesses have seen a direct impact.
That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying it. The banks have withdrawn, and some of them have put services into post offices. Has there been an increase in the footfall in the post office?
Apologies. I don't think that we've got that evidence.
We don't have the evidence for it at the moment, but what I would say about the post offices and the banking services, it's a very inconsistent picture across the post office network. Only some post offices provide all of the banking services. Some of the smaller ones don't provide a lot of the services that are available at the larger branches. And not all banks provide all of their services through the post office. So it's a very mixed and inconsistent picture, and it's also the lack of awareness amongst consumers of the service that the post office provide is a key issue, and that's something that we will be addressing in our research project going forward.
Yeah.
So in terms of the footfall, we don't have that evidence, but it's something certain we can come back with.
And I appreciate this is a post office argument, but some of the impacts on the post office has been a result of banks making decisions. And where a singular bank might make a decision in a village which will impact a bit, when 4 banks decide to do something, those collective decisions have potentially ripped the heart out of that community. And I think some work would need to be done there. The banks are also very fond of waving a mobile phone at you and saying, you know, sure, this is your alternative. And you've already pointed out some flaws, and at least the potential for analysing some of that. But is there any bit work being done around the quality of broadband access, the quality of the interaction between particularly older people and that type of software or technology to counter or at least challenge in some way the proposals by the banks?
No, I think that we haven't been doing that work, but I think that that's a really important point, because I think it's something like 24% of Northern Ireland don't have access to broadband for a number of reasons. Either geographically it's not available, or people choose not to use it, or people just aren't skilled or confident in using it, and they're all very separate arguments, but kind of compound the issue. We have a consumer skills programme, but again it goes back to that issue. If people choose not to use online technology, or people can't physically get access to it, then there always has to be some sort of an alternative. I think that's some work that probably needs to be developed and more to be done.
And other considerations got to be taken with the cost of broadband, because some people, while they accept it now as being a necessary part of daily life, it isn't a free part of daily life.
No.
And there's an added bill to those that might find it difficult. But this discussion is teasing out, if you like, I think, some areas that might be relevant to your future research. And I would certainly find that helpful. I don't know if it's your job to do it, but I think there are areas there which need to be looked at.
I think just to come back on what you were saying, we have previously, under our predecessors had under Consumer Futures and Consumer Focus Post, we've identified this issue where people are not skilled or they don't have access to broadband. There has to be an alternative, and the post office is ideally situated as a digital bridge for those consumers. Whether it be to get public services, whether it be banking, and in that respect, I suppose we've called through the all-party group on a diversification fund for the post office, because it is there, it's providing a service to the citizens of Northern Ireland for that reason, to be the digital bridge. Many older people especially feel comfortable going into the post office and interacting with the sub-postmaster, and it is ideally placed, and it should be something that's supported by our executive and our government here.
Thank you, Chair.
Sidney?
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief as possible. Maybe some items have been touched on because I had to leave there. But you touched on the post office network. Do we know, I'm being a rural dweller myself, how many post offices have closed throughout the rural areas over this past number of years? Because it's something, post offices are really at the heart of the community in rural areas, and provide a great service, and it's something that rural people have grown up with. So I just want to see what percentage of maybe available post offices are there now compared to say 4 years ago.
There are, since 2010, the UK government have made a commitment that there is no post office closures. They've put in place £2 billion to invest in the network, so there hasn't actually been any closures. If a branch closes, it should open up in an alternative location close by, and this is underpinned by minimum access criteria, where a post office in a rural area should be within 3 miles of the next one. In an urban area, it's within a mile. What we would see is that they're changing models. They're moving from the standard traditional post office into retail outlets on many occasions, but that is for them to become more sustainable and more dynamic going forward. So there hasn't actually been any closures. There's 480 post office branches in Northern Ireland.
I'm just wondering, that's why I'm asking. I think the Chair touched on about moving into a different area of supermarkets and things. I'm just wondering, has there been any areas, and you touched on it with the 3 mile radius there, where a small post office who was not able to move into that area and there's no facility for a supermarket. What happens in that occasion, in that situation?
Well, then,
has there been any cases like that?
Absolutely. The Post Office have identified over 100 of those 480 post offices as community branches, and that means they will continue to be funded post-2018. Essentially, they're the last shop in the village, so there is no alternative for them to move into other premises. So what you will see there is that the sub-postmaster exists on the same contract that they're on at the moment. There is no alternative in a lot of cases. In some cases where a post office closes for outside of reasons, post office, the sub-postmaster takes sick. Post office do try their best to put in an alternative. There's a mobile post office solution in some areas of Northern Ireland. There's also outreach solutions where a nearby sub-postmaster would come into a community hall for a couple of days a week to service that community. So there are alternatives, but we're pleased to say that where the post offices are in most vulnerable communities, where there is no alternatives, they are protected.
Are you happy that there is being catered for, or is there more work needs to be done there?
Well, at the moment, those community branches are, the UK Government have said that they will fund them going forward. Where we would be concerned about is the other branches going forward, where they're moving into retail premises, because whilst the government have maintained funding until 2018, post-2018 there will be no funding available from the UK Government. So are these post office models standalone? Are they profitable? And that's where we again get back to the diversification fund. Can our executive help these retail shops be profitable and support the post office network?
Something needs to be watched and looked for in the future. Just quickly with a couple of points. There are big issues with taxation of vehicles at the present time, since it all moved to Swansea, but I do know the post offices are providing a great service in that area, and is it something that you would promote and encourage people to use more post offices instead of getting tied in with computers for an hour or 2 hours to try and get a car text? But it has happened, and even last week I've known of cases, and it's a terrible situation, but the post office seem to be able to cope better with this. So going forward, it obviously is maybe an area that the post office should be.
So again, it sort of goes back to the point that I said, about the post office becoming a digital bridge and position itself as a front office for government services. We need more local, devolved, central, all government services to go through the post office to help make them more sustainable going forward in the future. They've lost a lot of business through the TV licence, and they are continuously competing with competitors whose margins are a lot tighter than post office, and their network PayPoint would be a lot more nimble and flexible than the post office network. So, I think we have to understand that the social value that the post office brings, and to help sustain them in the future going forward.
Maybe even dog licences from local councils.
Well, some of them do.
Yes. I'll finish on this. Cathy, I think it was you mentioned down in the Armagh area that you were able to do work in reference people who were a bit concerned about a new post office and the way it was opening up, and you managed to get 6 months free car parking spaces.
Yeah, for the post office.
Was that private car parking space?
Yeah, the parking spaces were owned by the supermarket itself, so that they charge all their customers to use their car parking.
My next question.
Within the
Why did it only have to be 6 months? Why does it not continue? Or can I don't know the area I'm from down that area, but I don't know the particular place you're talking about. But it would be a great thing if that car parking space could become free at all times.
What this retailer offers all of its customers with £15 or more spend, then they get free, is it an hour's free car parking, so you've got enough time to go in there and do your shopping, stock up on your groceries. With the post office, it started off with a zero base, they weren't given anything, and we felt that it would buy some goodwill with the consumers. It would also encourage that kind of behaviour change and get consumers used to using the new outlet, and once that they realised that actually, you know, this was a convenient place to use for postal services, that it would try and embed that.
Have you had any
change
feedback from
consumers?
From consumers that were concerned here? Has the feedback been positive, or?
It hasn't actually opened for business. It's
Oh, it
open
hasn't?
in the next month, but
So you'll await the feedback?
yeah,
We
absolutely.
will, and it is something that we do continue to monitor.
Monitor,
So
yeah.
even once the transformation has been complete, we do monitor the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sidney. In terms of the DVA stuff that Sidney raised, are you monitoring the success of the taxing of vehicles in the post office?
You've always been able to tax the vehicles in the post office for a number of years. We don't actually monitor that's commercially sensitive information
Right.
for the post office. We don't monitor that per se.
Right. Would you usually be able to find out from the post office, for example, many people attempt to tax a vehicle in the post office and are declined for one reason or another?
Yeah, we can.
Would they release that information to you, do you think?
Well, we can ask, and you know, it's up to them if they feel it's commercially competent.
Because I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence from people that are trying to tax cars that there are problems being presented in post offices, that you then have to phone DVA and wait an hour to get on the phone, and then there's
I think
bail handling, somebody phone you back within 3 days, and meanwhile you're driving about legally with no tax. And of course I'm not encouraging people to do that, and it's never something I would do. Like.
And again, I think that this goes back to consistency of services, because not all branches are able to offer the service, or there's restrictions on the extent to which some branches can offer it over others. So potentially that there is some development work there for post office, and also for how they communicate about what services they can deliver within each individual area.
But I think that maybe this change has been going long enough that teething problems should be sorted out. So can you even put out a message to consumers to feedback to the Consumer Council of what their feeling is, or how they're getting treated within the post office trying to tax a car?
Something we can do some work on. We can see how we can look into it.
Just a suggestion, please. You don't have to make a decision here and commit to it, but just a suggestion of something you could do in the future, Paul.
Yes, on a completely separate subject, although you did mention it earlier, and I apologise for this, and I don't mean to catch you in the hop, and we will take information at a later stage if that is okay. But the broadband issue, how are you finding the Northern Ireland Broadband Improvement Project as it rolls out? And is there any details you can give us around that and how it is being rolled out? I believe that Phase 2 has just completed, or should have completed, in September. I know that my own area around Ballymena is to be Phase 5 of 8 phases, probably commencing second quarter of next year. So I'm just wondering what your views are on it as it rolls out.
Okay. We don't have statutory remit for broadband, so we don't monitor issues like that. The information that we would get would be more about consumer behaviour and how consumers are accessing services. It probably would be Ofcom that would be able to provide that information, but certainly we can go and have a look and see if we can get any information to the committee.
Okay. I think, just on that point, sorry for throwing that at you, Cathy. I wasn't sure whether you had the remit or not. I'd forgotten. But could we ask for an update? Or maybe there's a briefing scheduled
written briefing next week or the week after, aren't we? On the responses to the consultation on the rural broadband scheme.
On the broadband improvement project going forward.
I think there's a written briefing on the responses to the public consultation in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
But I know we probably need more than the response of the consultation, because we're actually getting rollout now. I think Phase 2 should have rolled out, and phases are planted down in different areas.
We're getting a written briefing next week.
We
On the
are getting a
rollout,
written briefing.
and not just the response, it's the actual rollout of the
It's a written briefing.
broadband.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Kathy, I'm going to throw you another one here. It's also to do with telecommunications. Have you complained to BT about the fact they're putting the prices up for people that want a hard copy of their bill as opposed to an electronic copy?
We haven't submitted a complaint to BT, but this would be an issue that we would see, for instance, in the energy sector as well. We did a report quite a number of years ago called the cost to complain. And it did show that that was about people using 0845 numbers and numbers like that, where there may be a legitimate complaint, and especially if it was a billing issue, maybe an incorrect bill was already costing them money and they had to spend more money to get this resolved. On energy, we do know that within the tariffs, the different tariffs, there's a number of ways that people can save money on their energy bill, and one is switching suppliers, another would be switching billing information, so just getting it online as opposed to a paper bill, and the other is switching their payment. So although we haven't done that work on telecommunications, we do know that that's an issue, and I suppose similarly with BT, you do have a choice to switch telephone provider, and as companies, I think that within regulations the cost has to be cost reflective, so there is an administration cost with sending out a bill, so we would be interested, I suppose, if that cost was over and above, and if the company was profiteering out of that payment method.
Well, I think it's a charge of something like £1.56 a month, but you'll note that they never put the price down for people that opt for email. Let's put the price up for people that opt for the hard copy of the bill. So it's another one of these issues that's frustrating, particularly for vulnerable people or people that don't have a broadband package to access these things.
And there is a campaign as well, the Post-it campaign, Keep Me Post-it, which is a UK-wide campaign, and that's one of the issues that they're exploring, because obviously people who some people have no choice but to get the paper copy because of access to online facilities. But also there's a more significant issue in that when maybe you want to open a bank account or get a passport or access a number of official services, you need proof of identity, and if you don't have hard copies of utility bills, then that can be very, very difficult. So there's a number of issues that are linked to that, but the Keep Me Post-it campaign are working on that issue.
Yeah, I think we've thrown enough random things at you for one day, maybe.
I was going to throw in another.
Go on ahead, Stephen.
I thought it'd be remiss of us not to ask about the review of the Consumer Council. What, if any, feedback have you had from the department, and what has the communication from the department been like overall in terms of your review?
Well, the Minister's statement did recommend a number of changes in how we worked, and I think that the Minister's statement was rather in line with our own thinking, that we know that we have to get better at partnership working. We know that there can be an issue with outreach, and certainly in going forward, and well, I would like to think that maybe people have recognised that even during the review process we were trying to make those engagements and make sure that we were covering sort of the length and breadth of Northern Ireland, trying to get out there and deliver services as far and wide as we can. Our business plan for 14-15, so our current business plan has been signed off by our council at board level, but it's yet to be signed off by the department. So obviously that's a difficulty for us. We have recently had, last week, I went to meet with the department along with a colleague to have early initial discussions about the business plan for 15-16. But as you can imagine, that's difficult whenever our current business plan hasn't even been signed off. And we still don't know about our budget for our current year with the budget cuts that are being imposed at the minute. We haven't got confirmation of the final figure yet.
And in terms of your sign-off of your business plan, is the delay due to the cuts that are coming in, or what reason have you been given from the department for their...
The department wanted... presentationally, the business plan, the department wanted our impacts or measures to be presented in a different way. They had some concerns over SMART objectives. We have addressed that and we've taken all their comments on board, but the business plan remains unapproved from the department's end. But we have taken on board what they've said, and we have got the services of the Daddy Bit team working with us going forward in our 15-16 business planning phase. So, we want to get this right. We want to be able to come here at the end of the year and be able to tell the committee the fantastic impacts that we've secured for consumers. It's important to us to get this right, but it is a process, and at the minute we are working to the business plan as approved by our council as far as we can, given the budgetary constraints.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much for your presentation and facilitating us with obscure questions. We genuinely appreciate it. We'll move on here. Agenda item number 6, matters arising. There's one item in the index at page 36, and this is correspondence from the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation at page 37. Following an invitation from this committee, the Oireachtas Committee has agreed to participate in an informal meeting with this committee on the 3rd of November. The committee content with the suggested approach. Both Intertrade Ireland and the Centre for Cross-Border Studies are available to brief both committees, and the meeting is planned for the Senate chamber on the 3rd of November from 11 to 3:30, with lunch being provided. Now, there may well be a problem with the second stage of the insolvency bill being scheduled for that day to facilitate the committee meeting on the Tuesday. So, if that's the case, then Jim informs me that they may well try to defer this meeting for a week or so to facilitate the debate on the insolvency bill. Members content with that approach? We'll see when the second stage of the bill has been debated and reschedule this if required.
Yeah, okay. Or can we squeeze it on up throughout the day? No? Would that be... keep it on the same day but just push it up further? I suppose we don't know when...
We don't know exactly what time of the day the debate will be at, just near how long it will go on.
Primary legislation chair is usually the first item of business, so if it's on a Monday it'll be starting at the start, and
it'll go on as long as it goes on.
And of course the chair and members and the deputy chair will be in the chamber.
Yeah, okay.
So agreed with that approach.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. If it does happen on that day, can members contact the committee office will contact members regarding availability and further details to confirm the arrangements. Agenda item number 7 is an EU Matters newsletter produced by the Assembly Research Services, and the paper for this item is at page 39. Members, any comments, or are you content to note?
Can I just ask, Chair, is this compiled in conjunction, do we know, with, for example, Belfast City Council that has a European unit? Is there a joint office, effectively, is what I'm asking, between the regional government here and the council? I think there may be a European office now in Londonderry as well, but in relation to this publication, it would be useful to find out if it is done in a joined up way.
Well, I think we can approach Shauna, who's the recently appointed EU Affairs Manager within the Assembly, and seek clarification as to what contact has taken place with the EU units in the various councils to make sure that there is a joined up approach here. Members happy with that approach? Agenda item number 8, the October monitoring round. Table today is the October monitoring round from the department, which are briefing noted at page 14, and the October monitoring round papers begin at page 15 in your table papers. If members require any further information, we have two officials from the Finance Division. Do members want to bring them in to hear from them? Have members had a chance to read through the pack, given that it was tabled, or do you want to bring them in to hear what they have to say?
Oh, well, I haven't had a chance to read through
We'll bring them in.
properly. If they're here, if they can be,
They're here outside, Nathan, are they?
if they can be
Happy to
brief,
bring them in.
they actually go over it. Would be
There's three of them. Okay. So briefing the committee today is Trevor Cooper, who's the head of Finance Division, Bernie Brankin, who's the head of Finance Branch, and Mike Thompson, who is the head of Deputy Tourism, Telecoms and GSNI Policy Division. Trevor. Trevor, we decided we'll hear from you because we really haven't had much of a chance to look through the papers. So if you want to briefly run through the papers to give members a rundown of what's included, we'll see if there's any questions afterwards.
Okay,
All right.
certainly. The paper details our input to DFP on October monitoring. So essentially it covers resource bids and, in the main, capital reduced requirements. We're all aware that in year there are going to be cuts that fall on departments, so we would propose to put a separate paper to the committee on in-year cuts as and when we get clarity on the actual cuts that we'll be subject to in year. So at this point in time we don't have a definite position on the cuts that will actually apply to departments. So turning to the paper, we have substantive bids, i.e. bids over £1 million in two areas, Invest NI and the Tours Board. The Invest NI bid for £10.65 million relates to support for companies for investment and employment growth in relation to offers under the Collective Financial Assistance Programme and also support for research and development investment under its R&D schemes. Split between the two would be roughly 80% selective financial assistance and 20% for research and development investment. The Tours Board bid for £4.55 million resource relates to a number of events, including the Milk Cup, the North West 200, the West Belfast Festival, the Ulster Grand Prix, Foyle Maritime, the Tall Ships, the Open, the Giro and the Irish Open. So there's quite a number of events in 14-15 that bid relates to. Turning to the reduction side of the paper, in terms of mainstream reductions, on the resource side we've only a very minor reduction. We have a 120,000 resource reduction on the Interreg programme as SUPB has revised its forecast spend for projects under the programme in 14-15. So that expenditure would now fall to next year. On the capital side, the Tours Board has a reduced requirement of 1.45 million on the waterfront. Essentially, that project is being managed and delivered by the Belfast City Council, and my understanding is that they have now appointed the main contractor who has given them more clarity in terms of the forecast spend. So the latest forecast suggests that funding won't be required this year, so it would fall into next year. And I think we've got a reasonable view that going forward the capital position will remain much easier than the resource position, so we would expect that shouldn't create major difficulties going forward. Within the department we have a capital reduced requirement of £500,000 on the gas line pipeline project, and that is because the licence is now expected to be awarded around December, so we don't expect any spend to fall in year at this point in time. We also have a 100k resource reduction on the science park, capital reduction on the science park. That spend is actually resource, so we'll be funding it from the resource budget. Turning to capital financial transactions, Invest NI is releasing £5 million. The main driver behind that essentially relates to the agri-loan scheme, where there have been some issues around planning permission for the people who are putting up the sheds, which has deferred some expenditure under the programme. But I think probably the main reason for lower expenditure under that programme is that the applicants are actually getting funding from their banks in any event, so that they don't have any need to resort to the scheme. So that's actually a good news story, that bank funding is being freed up in that area. The other issue in relation to financial transactions relates to the second film studio. And I think we've got greater clarity from the promoters in relation to their spend. So that relates to loan funding from Invest NI to the promoters who would put up the studio, and they've actually, in terms of their project management plan, they've given us a greater insight into when their spend would actually fall on the ground, and the best view would be that it would be next year as opposed to this year. And again, we don't see that that should create any major issues in terms of capital funding being available. So look, that's a sort of very brief overview of the main areas of our monitoring input, and I'd like to take any questions.
Stephen?
Looking at the bid for Northern Ireland Tourist Board, the major events, obviously we've had the recent announcement that the event fund is going to cease. So this is essentially existing commitments?
Yeah, that relates to 14-15 commitments, so that's for spend in this year. There are also some commitments on events that would fall into next year, and my understanding is that that relates to about £1 million, and there's no question in terms of any commitments that we've entered into, those will go forward.
This was essentially committed expenditure then. Why is it outside the annual budget? Why is it being bid for as part of the monitoring, right?
Well, it's part of the normal monitoring process. So normally the monitoring process would involve departments putting forward both reductions and bidding for pressures in terms of activities that they would see as being priority areas. So normally in a monitoring process and an in-year budgetary process, departments put forward reduced requirements, they put forward bids. So it's not unusual in any way that we would have an in-year bid for activities that we see as high priority.
I understand the process. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is, my understanding of the process, I suppose, is it's there for when you get unexpected. So there's been opportunities, and I know in tourism opportunities arise that you can't foresee. We haven't had really any time to look at this, but I'm just wondering, out of those events, to me they seem, a lot of them are annual events, so they would have been foreseen costs, and that's why I'm wondering why they're being covered through monitoring, right?
Well, in terms of them being annual events, these are events that we have looked at this year and said, look, these are important. We believe we should support them, and on that basis, we're seeking the funding in year. It is a normal budgetary process.
But you didn't look at them at the start of the year and say we will be funding these?
Well, we looked at them during the year. There's an annual, there's a process that you would go through in terms of deciding this is the sort of level of funding that we would look at on non-major events. We believe that's important, and we believe that we should therefore seek to secure that funding in the in-year process. And I don't think, that's part of the normal process. Now, this year, June monitoring didn't effectively release significant funding, other than the 7.7 that was put into the Invest NI baseline, although that was a reinstatement. So, the availability of funding is slightly different in year, but the process,
I suppose is that what I'm getting at, is the process sustainable in restricted budgets whereby you almost assume we'll get this money? It's committed spend. So you're essentially saying you must give us this money, we need to spend it, and the department might well turn around and say, well, we don't got it to give, with cuts, etc. So my question is, going forward, is this a sustainable way to budget?
Well, that's something that the executive will need to look at in terms of the whole budgetary process going forward. You know, I think we recognise that the financial position across all departments is going to be difficult in future years, and indeed that's why the Minister took the action with the Tourist Board in terms of events funding calls for future years. It's clear that at this point in time we don't have a firm position on what our budget is going to be next year. It wasn't unreasonable to enter into commitments for the projects which were given multi-year offers. I think the total funding involved is around about £1 million, which would be the baseline amount that we'd normally, that we have in our budget. So, that's a reasonable thing to have done. The different place that we're in at the minute is the budget process hasn't started in any major form, so we don't have clarity in terms of what the funding position will be next year. So I think we've taken prudent action, and I think as and when we get clarity, then if we get funding over and above that amount, then we would assess the position and potentially move to further calls under the scheme. But I think it's totally reasonable, the position that has been adopted, and prudent, in fact.
Okay, thank you. Chair.
Paul?
Yeah, just to elaborate on that point, because I think Stephen has an important issue. I'm completely fine and comfortable with in-year monitoring and for bidding in what is a longer budget period that we have in Northern Ireland compared to other jurisdictions. So that's not the problem or the issue for me. But the issue is, as we go to scrutinise the in-year monitoring bids or rounds, it's very, very hard when we've only got the snapshot of that monitoring round. So I think it would be important that we had the context of previous monitoring rounds, like June, because it begs the question, if it is inescapable, a bid of 4.55 million resource for these events that happen annually, did you bid for them in June? And were you refused?
We did, yeah. We put forward a bid. I think it was 3.9 million in June. So that June, the only successful bid that we had in June monitoring related to effectively a reinstatement of baseline in Invest NI, which was taken off us. So the bid wasn't successful in June, and it was bid for.
Okay. Second question then. Out of the 2.3 for the events fund, contractual commitments where letters of offer have issued. Now you list a whole range of events, very, very successful, very, very important to Northern Ireland. North West 200, Milk Cup, and the Northern Ireland Open Challenge, which is the golf competition in Galgorm. Which is Galgorm, which is my constituency, which is very, very important to Northern Ireland, and especially the local area of Northumberland. But are these events last year's events, or are they next year's events?
These events would be this year. This is just related to the spend on these events this year. So there may be activity, A, events that have already happened, and B, any activities that would happen between now and the end of the year.
Okay, but within that list you have events including the Tall Ships 2015. They're the future events.
There would be some marketing activity in preparation for those events.
The vast majority are the events that are happening this year, 14-15, but there are some, as Trevor says, like Tall Ships that are preparatory work, preparatory expenditure for events happening in future, next year or indeed future years.
So all of these, North West 200, Milk Cup, Ulster Grand Prix, the Golf Northern Ireland Open Challenge, Foyle Maritime, Belfast Maritime, and the MAC, that is all things that have happened.
Yes.
It's not even talking about next year's events.
No.
Right. Okay. And that's why they're basically inescapable.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Begs the next question then. Have we implanted in our budget for next year this money for this funding?
No department has a budget for next year.
Because the 4-year budget is up, basically?
So
right, okay.
there will be a budget process which should provide clarity to departments on their budget next year. Events is something that we will certainly be bidding for. We'll certainly be bidding to get an increase in the baseline that we have in relation to events, because we see these as being key activities. We see them as giving pretty high return to the economy. We have been exceptionally successful in terms of, from DTI, the Tours Board, taking on the events function. I think it's fair to say there's been a step change in terms of, the bang for your buck that we get from events, and B, the actual quality of event that's coming to Northern Ireland. So, on that basis, we would very firmly believe that we should get an increased budget baseline in the budget process. And I believe it'll be one of the areas. Obviously, we haven't actually input to the budget process, but I think it would be pretty clear that this would be a priority area in terms of us bidding to get that baseline cover for these important areas.
Last question. Obviously, 4-year cycle with regards to budget, in your monitoring round, and all of that goes on, that gives us the flexibility within it. But in the nature of your department, you have InvestNI who are trying to crank up the work with regards bringing in jobs, and that takes time. Hence the reason why you were able to hand back money
in earlier years.
In earlier years.
And now
you're now up to a bout of speed that is actually producing something. And of course, then you talk about the year-in projects that are there and are very, very good, which are important to us. Now that we've got to the age or the end of the budget term, we now then go into a new budget term. How important is that? How important is it for you as a department to get that resolved as quickly as possible? And when do you see that starting, that process of negotiating a new budget?
Well,
because what you don't want is InvestNI to stop or slow down whenever it has built up a body of steam.
And in terms of those bids, the executive has made it clear that any there would be, when the economy changed and ramped up, as you say, that those would be calls on financial assistance contracts that would have to be met. There's also the Industrial Development Guarantee, whereby the executive has committed that no worthwhile project would be lost for lack of funding, even if that meant diverting resources. And indeed, in the Finance Minister's paper on June monitoring, there was a recommendation that InvestNI's bids in year be treated with the highest priority. In terms of getting clarity on budgets going forward, I think all departments would say that it would be very important to get clarity as soon as we possibly can in terms of the baseline position, in terms of the funding that will be available for key priorities. So,
when's that conversation to be had? Is there a timescale?
I think there have been a number of conversations around the budget process. At the start of the year, the FP had hoped that the budget would be able to be published. My understanding is that there would be a budget process that would commence in January, that would have a draft budget published in June, would be out for consultation and would be finalised by the end of the year. That timetable hasn't been able to be managed, so we're now in a position where, ideally between now and the end of the year, certainly before the end of the year, those budget interactions and negotiations would happen, so that departments would have clarity as early as possible, and particularly before we go into next year, in terms of their budget allocations, and indeed, if there were to be any reductions as well, clarity on where those, the level that those reductions were, because when you're making reductions, you may make different choices. If you have greater clarity sooner in terms of A, that you're going to have to make them, and B, the level, The longer that you go into a year in terms of getting clarity, then the less options are available to you as your spend is committed. So you might have to go to areas that you wouldn't otherwise have gone to because really you don't have any other options. So I suppose, you know, from anyone's perspective, it's important. It's important that we engage and get clarity on the processes as soon as we can.
Okay.
And, you know, my understanding, I believe there's an executive meeting tomorrow, which I understand is going to be discussing budgetary matters.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
In terms of the internal preparatory work for next year's budget, how far advanced are you with it? Or are you waiting for some kind of a direction from the Minister and the Executive as to what the financial outlook will be?
Well, you know, in preparation for next year's budget, obviously, we would have engaged with our bodies in terms of, you know, being ready to put forward bids, potentially looking at areas of committed expenditure in future years, and in areas that are uncommitted. So, you know, we have been doing preparatory work, but I think we will need some guidance around, well, what is the process that this is going to be managed under? What is the timeline that you're going to be working to? What are the potential, you know, levels of reductions or otherwise that departments may face? So those are all. So you know, you can do preparatory work, but I think, you know, will need to get some more clarity on process and on the timelines and the sort of impacts that may fall.
And what sort of a percentage figure are you giving arm's length bodies in terms of a reduction next year compared with their projected budget for this year?
Well, you know, I think that's something that we need some central guidance on in terms of, you know, what might that level be.
So you're not using a figure with them?
Well, you know, in terms of a figure, there's many potential figures that you know, one might plan for. Those figures, I think there were indicative figures that we had previously engaged with, that all departments were advised of, around about, I think it was 4 and 6%. So
but that may change subject to executive agreement as to what the actual level of cuts are. So
and that's for 2014-15, not for the rest of 13-14?
No, for 15-16, all departments were advised, you know, you might plan around cuts of between 4 and 6%. Now, it's likely that level of reduction will change, and I think, you know, the executive may give greater clarity on that as part of the outworking of the process from tomorrow.
Right. And in terms of the rest of the 14-15 financial year, what is the department preparing for? Because and maybe it's been left to the Minister to come and tell us herself, but the likes of the information I've got in the Employment and Learning Committee is a lot worse than this. Are you not preparing for similar reductions for between now and the end of the financial year that other departments are, and just we haven't got it in written form, or what's the story?
Well, you know, I think we will separately brief the committee on potential reductions once we have greater clarity on what those numbers might be. I think it's clear that there will be reductions of 2.1%. Which from this department's perspective equate to around about 3.8 million. There is the potential for additional reductions over and above that, but as yet, you know, departments were advised to plan for the potential for additional reductions of 2.3% over and above that, but that hasn't actually been absolutely confirmed.
But have you prepared for it?
We've been looking at potential options.
Okay.
In terms of putting those options into play, the Minister is reviewing them. There will be decisions made in terms of implementing reductions, and we'll come and brief you fully as and when. Okay. You know, the Tourism Innovation Fund is one area where that uncommitted expenditure. We've recognised, look, there's uncommitted expenditure. It's not that it's not an important area for the department. It's not that it doesn't give great benefit. It was an area of expenditure that's uncommitted, so we've had to go there.
And to see the bids you've submitted...
But there will be reductions over and above that.
But to see the bids you've submitted for committed expenditure,
yeah.
What happens if you don't get it?
Well, I think it's premature to get into that
speculate,
space.
Speculate.
Well, I think...
All of it idle speculation.
I think it's reasonable to expect the executive to follow through on the commitments that it's given in terms of the budget realignment commitment, that financial calls would be met, B, the industrial development guarantee, where there is an assurance that no worthwhile economic development project would be lost, and C, the Finance Minister's view that the bids should be given the highest priority in the next 2 monitoring rounds. So it's not somewhere I want to go at this point in time.
But would there be potential legal avenues open to companies that offer these commitments in the event that the previously agreed commitments weren't adhered to?
These are legal commitments, so
okay.
They'll be honoured.
So there's a legal onus on the department and its agencies to. Okay. Virgo?
Yes, thanks very much. And just continuing that, against the narratives where these are building, if you like, as projects, that there would be a natural inclination or instinctive reaction to support that. But had you known on the other side what you now know about the failure of the monitoring round in terms of being able to deliver, would you have built them into the budget in the first place? Those projects like the GRO and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think in this budgetary process, there was a change in the way that our budget has been set up. So, there was a reduction in the baseline, in the expectation, and in the recognition that we would rely on funding in year as and when it becomes available out of the monitoring rounds to meet these important commitments. So there was a recognition when the economy's down, there won't be this need for this money. As the economy rises and invests in NI's success, and it's been very successful in securing jobs and employment projects, there's recognition, well look, the better way to do that was to get the funding in year. Now, I think it's something that we'll have to review in terms of the budget going forward and the approach to that, because in a scenario where funding becomes more difficult to access in year, is it the right way to approach it? And that's something that we'll have to look at pretty hard in the budget.
In the interest of being prudent, you can't leave yourself exposed for next year, so you're going to have to put now bids in for next year in full, if you like, an anticipation of those. So in that respect, is the monitoring round now defunct?
I'm not sure that that's a question that I would...
But sorry, from your perspective, you can't rely on it. It was great when it was a comfort blanket and you knew you could sweep into it every June or whenever it came round, but you can't rely on it now.
I think going forward there will be in-year monitoring processes. I think each department will need to review, well look, how do we look at our overall budgetary management approach in the budget. I take your point in terms of
it's the word prudent that you used earlier on.
I take your point in that it's, we may be moving into an era where there is less money becomes available in the in-year process. That's something that each and every department is going to have to look at in terms of...
But isn't there going to be an added pressure in that? Because notwithstanding your need to reduce consistent with the overall reductions, you're going to max your pack. You're going to have to. So we're going to get another failed process, if you like, following through if we can't rely on this process, not call it failed completely yet, but if this process isn't going to work for you, you're going to have to bid to the ceiling to ensure that you get your funding, and that will be also what all other departments are doing. So there won't be a process to deal with.
And I think that's where the executive then makes choices. And that's part of the budgetary process. But I couldn't say, I can't get into an area where I would second guess the sorts of decisions that the executive would make
just to be clear, neither am I asking you to make a decision on that. I'm just merely talking about you as a prudent accounting officer sitting here.
I'm not an accounting officer. I am an accountant.
Well, you are an accountant.
Sure,
but you
absolutely.
perform
And
that
we're very,
function
very
clear.
prudent individuals.
Yeah, and you have to be prudent.
But no, I take on board your point that there's likely to be less funding in general for initiatives, new initiatives. I do think that in any budgetary process, the executive will have to set its priorities.
Yes, but just to be clear, you can't rely on the monitoring round next year in the same way that you've done over the last number of years. So you will be bidding in to ensure you match your expenditure levels for next year.
We will bid in for our forecast expenditure requirements and for forecast priorities. I think any and every department will do that in the process going forward. I think it's normal and part of the budgetary process then for the executive to look at those bids, look at those things. Well, these are new initiatives. These are nice to haves, or these are inescapable. These are our highest priority area, and I think
your bids for these were inescapable before they happened and after they happened. So there won't be an argument. You'll have to bid in.
And we will. Yes. And we will bid it. We will bid in.
So you won't have next year going into the monitoring rounds bids like this for events.
Mate,
not successful.
It depends on the outcome of the budgetary process, and I don't think any department could say to you that in an in-year monitoring round going forward there wouldn't be bids. It'll depend on how successful we are. It'll depend on, look, are there priority areas that we think we would like to initiate this year, and unless the whole in-year budgetary process changes, there would be the opportunity to do that. But that's a big thing, and would be something that DFP and the executive would need to get into the area.
And Chair Stephen wants to, but just to clear, this is not theoretical or academic. It's a discussion, of course, but it's something that's hard-nosed in that sense.
But would it not be fair to say that in-year monitoring should be for wants rather than needs?
Well, it depends on the approach to your funding model. So, if your base funding is purely, if you've been given base funding for your needs, then I accept the point. If your funding model is on a different basis, then, you're in a different space there.
Okay, thank you.
The department's in the news for a couple of legal challenges. One department's taken against BMAP, and one that is supposed to be taken by the department by Tamboran. Have you the money to fight those legal challenges?
On the basis that the legal challenges go ahead, the money would be made available, yes.
And where would you get it from?
From within the budget resources that we have.
So the
for a bidding process.
The de minimis bids in here for inescapable pressures across steady core business areas, including legal advice. Does that cover either of those two legal challenges?
I don't think the Tamboran issue wouldn't fall. There wouldn't be any costs that would fall to the department on that, would there, Mike?
So.
Or would they? Well, they would, yeah. But is that
to the right? We have not received anything.
Right. So, look, on the Tamboran one, there hasn't been. My understanding.
We're aware, like you, of Tamboran's position, and again, we obviously need to be careful here if we are heading into a legal position. But as of today, sitting here today, the department hasn't received any legal challenge. But we are aware of what the company has said.
Are you confident that if a legal challenge was issued, that you have the financial resources to fight it?
I think, as Trevor said, the finances would be made available.
And the same with the BMAP one?
They would be made available.
Thanks very much. Is there anything you want to add? No? Right. Thanks, William.
I know we're keen to get wrapped up, but my point earlier, monitoring rounds is okay, but for us scrutinising them, you really need the context of what they did before and what they're... Is it possible, I know we fight to Neil to get these quickly, but even if we have them logged and we could pull up what bid was June or even last year's round of monitoring rounds, just to give us context.
Is that something you can facilitate, Trevor?
The forums do give you what happened in previous monitoring rounds, but nothing happened really in June monitoring apart from the 7.7. So the forums are designed to give you the full picture of what happens in year. So when you see a bid coming through, was there a bid met in a previous monitoring round, would be picked up on the forums. That's what they were designed to do. But they only address the current year. They don't go back. It'll only, and it doesn't really work very well where there was only one thing happened for this department in June monitoring. So you're actually not seeing, because there wasn't any resources allocated apart from the 7.7 realignment, you're not seeing anything on the form. But in the normal process, you would see what's happening in each monitoring round, because we would be telling you if money went out of that area previously or money went into it previously. So that should give you an in-year position.
I understand, but even in the interest of scrutiny, can they...
Well, I think between
committee not have that
the committee, as far as I'm aware, the committee staff are in a position to offer that, and we'll have a discussion in the future meeting about what format we want them in, and we'll come back to let you know exactly what we want.
Thank you.
Members, agenda item number 9, correspondence, and the index for correspondence is page 45, and the papers are from pages 46 to 56. Are members content with the suggested actions in the index as listed? Great. Table today is correspondence from Full Circle Power detailing the major difficulties the project is facing due to the timing of the ROC deadline. This is page 10 of the table papers. Members content to write to the Minister to ask what plan she has to bring forward an earlier date for the introduction of a grace period. Agenda item number 10, the Forward Work Programme. Page 57 is a copy of the Forward Work Programme. Also included at page 65 is correspondence to the Chair regarding an invitation to host an external meeting. And I think we've previously discussed that it's quite difficult for us to hold meetings outside of Parliament buildings as a result of the clash of plenary business. Members will want to note that the Minister is scheduled to brief the committee on the 4th of November, which is the first meeting following the Halloween recess. Any other business? Next, we've had a request from Tony about the briefing on the agri-food sector. He's also briefing the Agriculture and Rural Development Committee on the same day, so he wants to schedule his briefing for us as late as possible. But he's the only award briefing we have, so Jim suggests we start next week at 10:30 and invite him in for 11 to make sure that he's not sitting at Stormont all day.
No, I understand that. No, that's okay, yeah.
So 10:30 start next Tuesday.
Can we not start at 10 and bring forward correspondence or whatever to fill up the time?
Yeah, why not start as the same as we did today? Because
we've only got one oral briefing.
But there's only one oral briefing, but there's bound to be other correspondence one thing. And even if it means we adjourn for 10 minutes, surely it's better to have all that done before.
Start at 10 and bring Tony in at what time?
No, stick with Tony at whatever time was planned, but just front load.
10:30.
What time is it scheduled to start?
Okay, we just schedule it for 10.
That's fine.
It doesn't start until 1:30, I think.
1:30. We'll just start for 10 and talk nonsense for a while and have them sitting outside there waiting.
Forget it that.
That makes no difference in an hour week.
Members are great.
Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room